I guess these things take a while to catch up to YouTube, but it says we're live. Let's give it a little bit of time and see how it plays out. So, what do you think, Manuel? What do you want to discuss in this live stream here?
Well, actually, I had a interesting thing. I don't know if I want to spend the live stream on it, but we can at least start with that. And it's the relationship between tolerance and mercy. Uh, I mean,
Hmm.
that's not a subject you see every day. Um,
I don't see that subject very often myself. Yeah.
so yeah, so tolerance is related to respect. Um,
Hmm.
to look back, right? Like I associate that with putting things in their place, knowing where they are,
Yeah.
um, and then that is a prerequisite for having right relationship to them.
Hmm.
Um, so tolerance is in some sense letting things be where they are or something. Yeah, we'll probably get to a better definition of tolerance. Maybe we should get the internet to help us out, and of course the comment section should help us out with this because yeah,
To a better definition of. Yeah.
uh, tolerance, permissiveness,
Hmm.
forbearance. Okay, so yeah, and then mercy is the way I was thinking about it is if you're looking at bodies, right, and then there's part of a body that isn't doing the will of the body, then it should be cut off. It should be the body should preserve itself, right? And then mercy is kind of like an in between state where you're not following through on the cutting off, although there is a recognition that the cutting off should have happened, and there
Right.
is no good justification apart from the benevolence of the body to maintain the relationship.
Hmm.
Um, So we got an interesting comment here. I think this was with tolerance, pretending you agree when you don't.
That's part of it. Certainly, is that concept. I think that's fair. Actually, I think it's fair. Or giving an affordance before it's asked for or understood. Right. In other words, you're going to tolerate something that is already in conflict with you ahead of time. Usually, not always. Um, or you're gonna forego action in the conflict, like actively. You're gonna say, no, 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 we're not gonna take any action on our conflict. We're just gonna avoid the conflict entirely. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, certainly, but you can have too much of anything. And I think that's one of those areas. And I think the way that relates to mercy is, if you're tolerant, there's no transgression. And if there's no transgression, it's hard to understand the concept of mercy. Like, if there's no transgression, there's nothing to be merciful for or about, or there's no target of the mercy at that point. And so you're cutting yourself off from mercy by being too tolerant. The opportunity for mercy now does not exist.
Yeah, so it is interesting. This is touching on one of my complaints about people nowadays, where they're privileging the maintenance of peace over asserting um, a a line, right?
A
And
value.
yeah. Well, just asserting as such, right? Like there's a privileging of the maintenance of peace, and you can say, well, tolerance is the foregoing maybe to go into the process of justice,
Right.
where you're temporarily suspending something in the assumption that, well, hopefully in the assumption, because else it would be corrupt, right? In the assumption that either you're trying to go to a different value, which is higher, right? So going to that process is more important than engaging in the conflict, or that the conflict will self-resolve over time. So it's like a conditional thing, and I I think the problem with the conditional thing is that you tend to forget that it's conditional. Like you just start accepting something that shouldn't be accepted as normal, because that's how it is,
Well,
and you
that's
lose the discernment.
but that's the interesting part. What you brought up there, and I do want to bring it down. But before I bring it to more pragmatic level, that's the important part. Like too much tolerance leads to normalization of all kinds of things, and some of the things that get normalized can be not good. That's why you can't just apply tolerance, right? You need temperance applied to your tolerance, so you're not just constantly tolerating, because it distorts normalization, right? Because the outliers, the people who are sort of out on the edge, are the most visible, right? Because they're the loudest. So even if there's only 4 of them, it looks like they're the majority, even though they're not the majority, they're minority. They're the loud, overly loud minority. So I want to put tolerance sort of in something like a community. So, and we can narrow it down a little bit more specifically, right? So let's suppose you have a Discord server or something. And I'm only using this because it got brought up yesterday on the Awakening server, right? You can't just let everybody in, because some people want to disrupt, like they actively want to disrupt. So if you're automatically tolerant and you let the disruptors in and you tolerate them, then there's a problem in that. And the problem in that is that now that they are in there disrupting, the destruction has already happened. And these people who want tolerance are basically going off the theory that everyone is basically good and is going to act good. I don't think tolerance suspends justice so much as it doesn't afford it. Like it cuts off the affordance of justice. You can't be just if you're tolerant first, because you never reach the point of judgment and where justice can be applied, we'll say, right? So you're still making a judgment. You're judging, I'm not going to do anything about this transgression. That's what tolerance is. We're gonna afford and accept the transgression without pushback. And I think that's where it's dangerous, because once you get a community, if you let people in with bad intent, and there are people in the world with bad intent, right? Or with an intent that is counter to your goal at the very least, right? Not everybody has the same goal. Not everybody has the same idea about the same goal, how to implement it even. So it's worse. You can have the same goal. That doesn't solve the problem. And once you get into that, if you tolerate that, it can create a schism, and then it breaks the community apart, or the community never forms, which is the more common case, I'd say.
Yeah, so I think there's a really interesting thing happening, right? Because there might be two. Well, so first of all, I'm just going to justify my use of the word suspension, right? So it's suspension is a temporarily not enacting of something, right? But I think there's two ways in which that can happen, right? Like one is consciously, right? Like you're like, ooh, this is not good, and you don't act upon it. And secondly is that there's a flow of information. Right? There's just this cascade of things that you have to relate to, and you have to realize which aspects are relevant to relate to, and things can just get caught in the flow. So I think this is actually connecting to a perennial problem. Like, okay, so we're necessarily limited in the actions that we can take, and now we need to privilege certain things, and then other things will get lost in the noise, right? And these might manifest as patterns over time, and these
Right.
patterns are then going to end up as normalization of
Right.
something that is bad, right? And you could
Right.
imagine that trauma works that way, right? Where it's like you look the other way because like the most important thing in the moment is not dealing with the transgression, but maintaining emotional health. And
I want to stop you there, man. You're going awful far, awful fast. I mean, but you said something really interesting and important to me. So when John Vervaeke talks about and then I want to address Lynn's comment there. But when John Vervaeke talks about perennial problems, he tends to talk about them as conditions that sort of come upon you, right? And you've pointed out something I think that's very important and quite brilliant, as you often do, right? Which is there's a perennial problem in the idea of tolerance, because the perennial problem is how and when and where to apply it. Like, when is it relevant to be tolerant, and when is it not relevant to be tolerant? And as you pointed out past that, you can run into an issue where too much tolerance leads to normalization of bad behavior, we'll say. Like suppose everybody's talking about being able to cross-dress and treat children like adults when it comes to sexuality, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere, right? That could happen in theory. I'm not making any statements. I'm just saying historically that might have happened, and it might happen again. And that's a problem, right? So you don't want to be overly tolerant. And then I did want to address Lynn. Lynn yesterday was perfectly justified in being angry at somebody who was being a jerk, and has since been banned from the server because after he was a jerk in the voice chat, and we were too tolerant of him, I would say. He went off in the text chat and spammed the text chat to an enormous degree, and apparently was just threatening people in cyberspace with physical attacks and stuff, which is just, it's absurd. But I think it's important too to kind of keep track of, right? Is that's what happens with too much tolerance. When you're too nice to people, they don't get a negative signal to stop, and that's unfair to them because now they don't know that they've transgressed. And as hard as it is to tell people, no, you need to stop because you're doing a bad thing. And how painful that is, you're denying them a good signal when you do that. And so you've got to be careful with that. The story of Samson. I don't know the story of Samson. These Bible people and their Bible-y things.
They're gonna have to get in and share some of that word with us.
No, I don't want to hear that Christian stuff, man. That's everywhere. Bible, like the most read book or something. Who reads that?
Proclaim the word, people.
Well, and where are they getting the tolerance doctrine from? Because again, Jesus also flipped over the tables. That wasn't the only thing he did. Yeah, I mean, tolerance is a tricky subject, especially for religions, because it's a perennial problem. How much tolerance? Perennial problem. We should write that one down. We've got notes. We should add to them.
Yeah. So we're getting a comment here, right? There's this thing where it's there's this build up. It's like snow or something, right, on your or leaves on your driveway, and it's like at a certain point, or even clean up your room, right? Like there's clutter, and then it's but that's okay. That's just one day's worth of clutter. Because I shouldn't be doing it every day, but then it's where's that boundary, and how do we protect that boundary? And part of it is a consequence of just having resources, right? Like you need to manage resources, and you need to privilege, and sometimes it's okay if your room is dirty because maybe you're not in it all day, and maybe you're outside doing things that allow you to maintain your room, for example, right? But then there's still this principle, right? Like it needs to get clean, right? You can't suspend cleaning up your room, and there's this point where you stop realizing that cleaning up your room is even a thing.
Well, I like that, Manuel, right? This analogy between tolerance and cleaning is really good, or clutter as such, right? So you have to allow some amount of clutter to get things done. Okay, so right now my office is completely clutter-free, actually. The only things in here other than my keys and my wallet and two of my one of my gargoyles, my boat, I got a couple of other things, right, are drinks that are leaving the room. right? And so, but it's too clean. Now this room's not useful. The computers are great, but this room's not useful. I have to go in the other room where I put all the junk and start adding some of the junk back in, right? Because there's too much potential here, but I can't manifest anything because it's too overwhelming. It's too much open space. But I have to, unlike last time, my office is built up and built up and built up. I have to leave some open space to manifest potential, whether it be leaving drinks on the table or, whatever it is. And tolerance is the same thing. Like, how much of transgression up front are we going to tolerate? How much transgression in the moment are we going to tolerate? It's two types, right? That's the perennial problem, is figuring out how much. And one of the things I was thinking about was like making my tea. I was like, we're awful caught up in doing things fast, like getting this done in like a faster teapot, which I have an electric teapot. It's very quick, right? And so what that does is rob us of time for contemplation. And then we discover meditation. It's like all we're really doing is adding in the time that we took away by making all the devices, making things go fast. It's like, this is madness. Why are we doing this? It's because it's another perennial problem. Like, how much time do you leave for contemplation, and how much time do you need to take action? Because those two things need to be put in what I call cooperative processing with one another, rather than opponent processing, because I don't like that term anymore. I don't think they're opponents. I think they're partners in cooperation. So it's a good question.
So yeah, too much tolerance leads to a lack of communication and of ethics. I think this is Mark's point in a nutshell.
I like that formulation. That's not bad. That's quite good. I think that's part of it for sure. Yeah.
Right.
What do you think, Manuel? You like that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's even more fundamental than the lack of communication. I think it's actually the atrophy or the not cultivation of a skill.
Oh yes, the skill of conflict. We're back to intimacy crisis, right? And so that's the positive aspect. We'll say the negative aspect is you're denying yourself the ability to conflict with people and still get along. Like Manuel and I are excellent at this. We still yell at each other, and we still manage to get along.
No, we don't.
No, yes, we do. Despite Manuel saying some incredibly stupid things sometimes, and despite me saying some incredibly stupid things sometimes, right? And yeah,
that's just his projection, Mike.
No, it's your projection, and that's the problem, right? And this is a good question, Chris. How did I feel my question PVK about speaking out against evil went? Like, see, what happened was 3 different people independently, maybe they know each other, maybe they don't, but independently came up with this question of tolerance. And then Ethan finally took it to me. Now, Ethan and I drove Ethan from the Minneapolis airport up to Thunder Bay. So it was like 6.5 hours or something in a car with him. It was a lovely experience. And just the act of going to Minneapolis instead of going straight to Thunder Bay opened up a wonderful potential for me that I never could have imagined. And it was wonderful, right? So Ethan was very concerned about this. And so he wanted me to address it. So because I had heard 2 other people talk about it, I'm like, it's time to talk about tolerance. And Vanderklay is wonderfully generous running these Q&As. And I was quite fortunate that I got in, right? And I got to put my question in place. And yeah, I mean, this is wrapped up in calling out evil. First, you need, and this is going to be the new focus on navigating patterns, my excellent YouTube channel, the focus on discernment, because tolerance gets you out of the job of discernment. And if you don't have to discern because you just say, I'm going to be tolerant, then you're not practicing discernment. But also, if you're not practicing discernment, judgment is even an option. Now you don't have to judge anybody. And you can always make the claim, well, I don't judge anybody, so why should you judge me? It's a very pernicious thing. Like, all these things have 2 sides. They have the side of what you're doing to the outside world, but also the side of what the outside world is doing to you. And so what that means is you can set up a defense. So I think I took a step in the right direction with PPK in particular, but I'm not sure that that full message is getting through about too much tolerance leads to lack of judgment, and lack of judgment leads to a lack of action. And if you're not going to act, the evil people are. And I think that's kind of, to some extent, what we're seeing. And so that's where the danger is. So when we're not, to the point here, right? When we're not practicing the art of conflict, when we're not practicing, pushing back on people, when we're not practicing being intolerant of certain types of behavior, right, then we're left with the extremes. And when you're left with the extremes, that always leads to war, at least as near as I can tell from my brief study of history.
Yeah, and I want to add in a different aspect is when you're not when you're being tolerant, you also lose the ability to take responsibility, because now your discernment about where you can take action and where you can't take action is changes, right? And then the way that you conceive of your agency. So when you look at the world, what are the levers that I can pull? Well, if there's no social lever of calling people to well, to a standard, then the only way is force, effectively, that's left to you, right? Like now it's like, okay, like either I do exclusion or I retreat, right? Like there's these hard boundaries that you have to enact, because you're not well, you're not doing the thing like with the sea, with the tides, where you're going like there's this recession where some of the beach is being scraped off by the tide, and then there's new things being deposited, and then there's a refinement over time, right? And then there's a way of being that is going with these waves, right? And when you're not going with the waves, then the wave is coming at you and it's smashing into you, and it's like, whoa, like I don't like this, right? And then you lose your footing, right? Like there's an inability to maintain yourself, right? So there's this element where there's a type of agency, and the agency is corrective, right? Which is, well, not a nice thing, right? Because we all like to be perfect, right? So being reminded of the ways in which we're not perfect is actually not pleasant. And yeah, we were talking about this earlier today, right, Mark? Where there's this aspect where being corrected is allowing the process of growth, and you can find joy, you can find fulfillment within growth, right? But the growth is always on the point of discomfort, right? So what that means is that there is a way to participate in the discomfort in a way that is emotionally satisfying and uplifting, and that's a skill that you have to cultivate, and I think that's the most powerful way of being that we need to.
And that goes back to your point, which is tied into this comment about tolerance also leading to a lack of introspection. I think that I like the way Pastor Paul Van der Clay talks about we outsource our sanity, right? He says this all the time. And it's like, so we outsource our skill at discernment, right? We have to, right? You want the distributed cognition. You want other people to help you. Am I being tolerant or am I being intolerant? Like that's a fuzzy line. And so if you're never able to enact intolerance, you don't really know what tolerance is, right? And if you're not drawing lines and on virtues and values, right, to the earlier point about training for ethics, because I think that's very true. You're training to some extent for ethics, right? Then you're not learning how to be an ethical agent in the world. Sorry, a moral agent in an ethical world, right? Your ethics doesn't enter into it because you're just being too nice all the time. So you're really not learning when to stand up for your own virtues and values, right? You're not making that distinction. And I mean, I like this comment. Tolerance is a tool, not a way of life. Right. And I think that a lot of people, especially the religious people, especially the Christians, are talking about tolerance as though it's a way of life because they're equating it with grace. But I'd say that no, tolerance destroys the opportunity to give grace entirely. There's no grace in intolerance because no one can transgress because you're being tolerant of their behavior. And that's not, that's not good either, because again, you're robbing yourself of all of these signals that you need from the outside world to be introspective, to learn discernment, and to learn grace.
Yeah, and I think the distinction is where, like, are you living under a watchful eye? Like, is everything that you do being judged, right? And do you have a responsibility towards that, or are you this carefree, naive person, right? Like, there's all of these youthful, I guess, are they virtues? Charming things, at least. I don't know if they're virtues, but there's this way in well, let's just say, well, I think there are virtues, right? Like there's a way of youthful participation that allows for growth, and for
Mhm.
improvement, and so I think they're virtues. They're ways of participating, but there's a, a way in which your relationship to them changes, and they mature to a higher level, right? So the naiveness turns into faith or something, right? Like there's
Yeah.
a way in which you become intentional in your participation, and
Well, and
the
and that's the problem, is intentionality as such, right? Like when you're too tolerant, right? If you're completely tolerant, and yeah, I agree with the comment. You can't be completely tolerant, right? But people are pretending as though they can, right? They're acting as if I'm acting as if I'm tolerant, and so what that does is it takes their ability to judge away from them, right? Because you're not judging others, you're not getting practiced in judging. Now you can't judge yourself. And so now you corrupt yourself because your judgments about what's right and wrong, it's kind of like, well, I'm tolerant of all these other people doing these things. So maybe I can do them too, because that's the normalization argument all over again, basically. So yeah, I mean, it just degrades society. So it's not that you can't try to do it, you can, but society degrades because you're not only you denying everybody else the signal of what's right and wrong by not judging, but also you're denying yourself that signal, and that's a big problem. And yeah, I like this. They're principles, right? They are
yeah,
principles.
yeah, I don't. Well, tolerance might be a principle, but I think naivety isn't.
No,
Like it is a
I don't
way
think
of
tolerance.
participation.
No, principles are the things you uphold through intolerance.
I like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, like I just want to highlight the distinction, right? Like a principle is is something that erects a hierarchy, and a, a virtue is a way of participation, right? Like, so it's not a hierarchy, but it is a way of discerning, a way of privileging, or ignoring information. Like it's functioning on a pre-cognitive level in some sense, right? It's like the spirit in which you're participating. So
Yeah.
Lynn had an interesting question that probably requires some unpacking, right? So the discernment, right? The way I look at it is you have uh, you recognize distinction, um, and recognition is a step further, because I think recognition is, well, it's right. So you're recognizing something. So you're bringing something back into awareness, or being. but but the recognition also requires you to have a judgment, right? Like it requires you to apply a meaning to a thing, while discernment is not requiring meaning. It just requires distinction.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, discernment is part of awareness, not part of attention. Recognition is part of attention because you've cognized through discernment, right? And now you have the opportunity to judge in some fashion. And maybe the judgment is, I want to bring this to my attention, and that's recognition. Attention and recognition are, maybe they're the same thing, or maybe they're related. But and I did want to back up real quick and say I think one of the problems that people have is that they're actually treating all things that you can do as principles. But I don't think that's true. I mean, I think a bunch of things that we can do are options, and then there's perennial problems because there's a cooperative processing trade-off that we have to make between things like how much tolerance do we give people, right? And when do we stop being tolerant of a certain type of behavior, of a certain person, right, in a certain forum? Like tolerance isn't a universal. You can't say, well, I'm just tolerant all the time in all circumstances. Like that's not good. And so we need to know that tolerance isn't a principle that you can uphold. It's a decision point that you have to enact, right, in order to be healthy. Like, because if you can't make judgments in the real world that other people can give you feedback on through distributed cognition, then, that's going to corrupt automatically.
Yeah, so that's interesting because this all originated from this really interesting question between mercy and justice, right? And I effectively said that, well, like you can't have mercy without justice, but you can have justice without mercy, right? So there's a hierarchical relationship where justice is a principle or a principality,
Yeah.
probably.
Yes.
and then because mercy is bumping into that, right? Like it's like in some sense bounding justice, or it's constraining justice. It's like a lesser thing, but it's still its own identity. So I think we have to make a distinction between the things that organize the hierarchy and then the things that care for the right manifestation of the hierarchy. And so I think we can put tolerance on that level, right? Where there's something like a functionality that the hierarchy needs to undergo, and maybe we can map this sometime actually, in order to remain healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even necessarily know if it's a hierarchy per se, but certainly there's an asymmetry, and Nassim Taleb talks a lot about asymmetries. That's kind of the core of his work, in some sense, is that level of asymmetry. And I think that this is a good point. Like you can't be without judgment, because in order to take an action you have to judge. And so you would remove your agency in the world if you never judged. And so yeah, you're lying to yourself to some extent if you think you're not judging. You're certainly making judgments all the time. And the question is, are they good judgments or bad judgments, right? Which is a different issue. And yeah, these sorts of things are always problematic for me. Frame of reference is an interesting phrase, right? Framing is the thing that matters the most, and this is why postmodernism is such a problem, because you're in some sense destroying framing as such, causing a problem with frames. And the problem, roughly speaking, that you're actually causing seems to be a problem around the inability to interact and participate properly with the world, right? And so you can be resigned to the fact of slavery, not in the US sense. The US, almost, when they say slavery, they mean chattel slavery, which is rare historically, and in the US. Like most of the people who were, quote, slaves in the US were indentured servants. And that was considered a form of slavery. Like, so there's different forms of slavery. And that's where the problem comes in, is that there's lots of different forms of slavery, and we're not taking them seriously enough, that there are different types and different forms, and then we're getting confused. And a lot of people knew all along, will say, that the important equation is not whether or not you are a slave. The important equation is what are you getting out of your interaction, right? And so your interaction actually matters, right? And maybe everybody's a slave to something. Maybe God, if you're a Christian, right, or whatever. And there are conditions, like you're a slave to the conditions you were born into. I mean, if you're born without limbs, you're a slave to that, right? If you're born with a high IQ, you're a slave to that too, because there are disadvantages, right? And that's the problem, is that we're all sort of enslaved to a bunch of things all the time, and it's not really a problem. I mean, some of these things we're quote enslaved to. Too much choice makes us paralyzed, right? It paralyzes us in a significant way. So maybe maybe it's important to not worry so much about that. And yeah, it's hard. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, I want to do something about the framing of this question or statement,
Please.
because I think there's a problem in the framing, right? So if you're living in a society where people do something, you don't have to be tolerant towards the thing that they're doing. Like the fact tolerating something means that you're disagreeing. Like if you're living in a society that has the institution of slavery, like why would you be tolerant towards the institution of slavery? Like maybe you approve of that. Like being tolerant is the recognition of a negative and the ignoring the negative for the purpose of maintaining peace. Like that's the definition I'll stick with for now, right? So like you could be tolerant towards slavery in a society where they have slavery, right? But now you're making a moral transgression against yourself and your society, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, not necessarily, right? It really depends on a lot of stuff. Like, there's nothing wrong with being tolerant towards slavery while moving away from it, which in the U.S. was very much the case, right? And then the people who didn't like slavery, for example, a lot of them, the founding fathers had slaves. Almost all of them released the slaves upon their death because they needed the slaves to run what they had. Like there was a condition that was built up, for better or for worse, especially in the South, where labor had to be free or the economy didn't work. In other words, people couldn't live there. And by people, I mean almost nobody at all could live physically, like survive. And people don't account for that. They just say, oh, well, everything would have been fine if not, if they had never started slavery. But the fact of the matter is, that area wasn't populated before chattel slavery came to the Deep South for a reason. And that reason was it's impossible to start the process of living in that area because the area back then was very difficult to live in. I mean, it's still not a breeze. Down in South Carolina, it's kind of hot in the summer, right? It wasn't habitable until people came in with free labor, although it's not free because you still got to house them and feed them and all that. We'll call it cheap labor. Until people came in with cheap labor, the South wasn't habitable. And that's the problem, is that people don't realize that trade-off.
I don't know. Are they built on foundations?
I think that's correct. Frames are built on foundations. The question is, what foundations are you building your frame on? And then the problem with that is that it's anti-postmodern, which of course is not a problem for me. I think it's great, but that means, right, that you can't just build frames anywhere. All frames are not equal. Your interpretation of Moby Dick is not necessarily valid, right? But that's based on the foundation. And then it's fair to ask people, well, what are you basing this on, right? And so, look, you might get into a tiff about whether or not something like Christian anarchy is a valid way to think about the world, right? And of course, my argument is that's a contradiction. It's not possible. If you talk to anarchists, and I recommend you do because I have, they don't recognize religion as a valid thing in the world because anarchy means not bowing to authority, like denying authority or not cooperating with authority. As such, period, any authority at all. That's what the definition means. Oxford goes way back, a couple hundred years at least. And so if your foundation is not stated, like Christianity means following Christ, who I'm pretty sure, I mean, I haven't read the book, but like from what I understand, he submitted to the authority of both the Jewish authority and the Roman authority, right, in his action of being crucified. So at that point, he is submitted to authority, which means if you want to be a follower of Christ or a Christian, then you also have to submit to authority. And so if you're submitting to in political authority, not just religious authority, political authority, and if you're submitting to political authority, you cannot be any definition of an anarchist. Like, right? But your foundation has to be correct. First, you have to understand anarchists don't believe in any type of authority at all. It's not political authority. It's any type of authority. They strongly deny religion. All of the ones I've ever met, and they don't allow people to identify as anarchists unless they also do the same thing, right? And so, what's the relationship between anarchist and antichrist? That's a good question. They sound pretty similar, but you can see the way in which the foundation matters. What's the foundation that you're using to define anarchy? What's the foundation you're using to define Christianity? Because if your foundation is Christ never flipped over the tables and never caused a kerfuffle, and he was very tolerant of everybody's activities, which I think is not in the Bible, but is definitely the opposite is in the Bible, we'll say, right? It's definitely sort of denied by the biblical text. Then, how can I talk to you, right? So you can set up a frame like that. You can set that up, but to the point, like if it's not built on a foundation, I can't go there to communicate with you. Like communication itself fails. This is why postmodernism is dangerous. It destroys language.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if frames are necessarily built on foundations. Good frames might be necessarily built on foundations, and I think there's also a question of justification, right? Like there's a justification behind the frame that allows it to be a valid way of relating to the world, and then within the frame there's a structure or something, right? That like maybe that structure needs a foundation, but it's
yeah. Well,
too far for for me in some sense.
I want to address this. Okay, guys, you got to understand something. Okay, when I make statements, they're usually well researched. I have spoken to anarchists about this. No, they would recognize the authority I'm giving to the definition of words. They absolutely do. Okay, and you can go on the internet and look, because I actually did some recent research because this came up with Michael Martin on Twitter, and I was like, you guys have to stop this. You've fallen into the postmodern trap of Satan, literally, like actual satanic behavior. You're distracted in weird definitions of configurations that are contradictory. So if you look, the anarchists on Reddit are saying you can't be religious and an anarchist. That's what they're saying right now. I'm not putting forth an anarchist heresy using the words. They do recognize the authority of words. They're not completely retarded like the communists, but or the pure postmoderns. That's true. And I want to address this. Yeah, we're all enslaved, right? But yeah, what are the limits of what are the limits of infringement on freedom? Right. And this is what we never talk about. We talk about freedom. We talk about how much we should have freedom. We don't define freedom. There's no foundation, to the earlier point, right? And then we say, but we should have this thing, but we're not defining the thing. And then anytime that anybody does anything we don't like psychologically, we just go, you're infringing on my freedom. Really? Like that? Is that the game we're going to play? Because that seems to be the game we're playing. It's a terrible game. It doesn't work very well for people. And that's where you get into trouble. And this is the problem. Like, you want to know what the problem is today? It's garbage like that, where we can't use words to a common definition, a foundation, right, to allow us to communicate, effectively. The question, to your point, where do we draw the line of freedom? This is, and you're not going to hear me say this very often, a political question. It's a question of governance. The principality of the government is the thing that definitionally, whenever you have a decision about where to draw the line of freedom, fundamentally, that is a question of governance and politics. It's actually a real political thing. Things that are not that, I have questions about whether or not they're political at all, but that's a different discussion, right? Where do we draw the line? That's the question of government. That's the question of governance. That's the principality of Caesar, or the principality of government that we're submitted to right? According to Christ, anyway. I mean, maybe you're not a Christian or whatever, then you're not necessarily submitted to it. But I think you are, to live with other people, right? So that's the question.
Yeah. So I wanna go in a little bit different tack, because when we're talking about anarchy or whatever, like communism, they build up this whole jargon, right? And this whole jargon is premised on a bunch of presuppositions. And so when we're saying the jargon is hard to understand, it's because, well, maybe it's wrong, right? Like maybe it's describing something not real, and they're pretending that it is real, and they're building uh, on false presuppositions. So we have to be careful with, like, there is a sense when you enter a new area, it's like, oh, like there's newness because there's a new area, but there's also, there might be wrong assumptions within that area, and maybe those are the cause of your misunderstanding, not so much that it's hard or whatever. Let's go to the next one. It's a combination.
Go ahead, read it.
It's a combination of submitting to authority but also telling the truth. They killed the Messiah not because he was following the authority, but rather against their authority, that he died willingly. Yeah, so we bring up this point fairly often, right? Like so there's a structure, and you either cooperate with the structure or you don't cooperate with the structure, right? But then there's also this question of, do you recognize the structure and its authority in the world, and do you submit to that? And I think those two are two separate questions, right? So I would say, as a Christian, you first have your allegiance to God, right? And then secondly, you have your allegiance to the identity that you inhabit on earth. And there shall be no gods before me, right? So if you swap the identity that you're participating in on earth to be higher than your submittance to God, right? Like now you start going out of balance, right? Like and you'll start corrupting the way that you manifest on earth.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's why tolerance is important, right? Because it all gets back to discernment and decision making and judgment. And you have to judge to make a decision. You have to judge something higher than something else, or something more important than something else, or more appropriately, something more important than all other possible things, because you're never making a decision between two things.
Yeah, so I think this is a reference to the Platonic idea of going outside of the cave. Yeah, well, yeah, that is an interesting question, right? Like, what do you do when you go back into the cave, right? Like,
or what is being in the cave? I mean, this is great, right? Because really, when you're in the cave, the only frames you're building are the projections on the wall. And we're not saying that's not useful, but it's also not housing. So I like this idea that building frames in caves are part of a compartment building project, not a housing project, right? So they're inherently, contribute to domicide, right? Because you can't live in those frames. And I think that's where the pragmatist is like, is this a practical frame? Is Christian anarchy a practical way to think about the world? Is social justice a practical way to think about the world? I'm going to do a video on that, on navigating patterns soon, right? Are these language constructions useful in navigating the world? Because society doesn't exist without justice, and justice doesn't make sense outside of a society. So can you split those two words apart like that and make a new object in the world, or a new conception of the world? I say no, you can't. Right? In the same way you can't be a Christian anarchist. Like a lot of these constructions are sort of absurd. Can you just gin up a new world like populism? So what do you think populism is? Right? Because I have this thesis about populism. Populism is democracy that you don't like. In other words, when you're in the minority and you find out that everybody thinks you're in the minority and that you're just a small group of like 4 people, then you call those people populists. You're like, you're not Democrats, you're populists. It's like, what? because you know, and I might be wrong, but look, I just can't find anybody trying to, you know, talking about populism that's using a definition that isn't just a definition of democracy. Uh-oh. Well, look at this. Why would anybody ask a question like this? I don't read books. Books are no good. I just burn them to keep warm. No, I haven't read that book. I don't know who that is. It sounds fascinating, though.
So I think it's interesting because if you look at what's happening in Plato's cave, right? Like they're stuck within this contraption that holds their head facing forward, right? So they're kind of yokes, right? Like there's a burden that they're carrying, a constraint that imposes a type of relationship with the world, and in order to get free from that constraint, well, yeah, like what happens when you take off this constraint? Well, now the way that movements function for you are different, right? Like you need to walk all over again because all the moves that you used to make, they're no longer the same. They don't have the same effect on the world, right? So in some sense, you're expanding the things in the world that you can participate with, and this can go back to tolerance, right? So what is let's just say I tolerate something. That means that I cast it as insignificant in some sense. Like it's like I don't have to have an interaction with that. Now, if I lift that veil, right, and I'm like, now, oh, this is a valid interaction at this point. Now I gain a bunch more options within my agency within the world, right? And now when we listen to Vivek, you talk about acceptation, right? Like this functionality can inform me about other places where I have to act in the world, right? Like it's not only something that's constrained to this specific area. This can bleed into other areas, and I think if we go back to this conception of the yoke, right? Like there's a limitation in the moveset. Like there's a limitation in the things of that we're able to participate with in the world, and that causes us blindness. And I think the problem that we're talking about is in some sense willful blindness. Like there's a and that's also Plato's point about the cave, right? Like people in the cave want to stay in the cave. Like when you start talking about them about not the cave, they're like, stop talking nonsense and leave me alone doing my cavey thing.
Right, right. Yeah, they're very upset to have their worldview messed with, even though their worldview doesn't relate to, we'll say, the world outside the cave, right? It doesn't relate to the quote real world. I really liked, like, if you guys haven't seen John Vervaeke's talk with Lantern Jack, Dr. Lantern Jack, on Dr. Lantern Jack's YouTube channel, man, about AI, the Matrix, and Plato's cave. Ah, I mean, Jack is awesome. But Vervaeke is doing a really good job there actually too, and I really like that conversation. I thought it was excellent. I know Pastor Paul's talked about it like 3 or 4 times. It's a really good talk. All of Jack's stuff is good, but that one in particular was good. It was out of format for his normal format, but it's good to understand how Plato's cave is still important and relevant today, especially with respect to AI, especially now that we have Chat GPT and all this crazy stuff that we have and all this hopefulness. And no, this time the AI is going to emerge and be real, just like the last 17 times we said it, it didn't happen. Yeah, and it's good to relate the parable of the cave back to our own experience in the world and realize that there are people, we'll say, out in the world that don't that don't understand the dual nature of the things that we're caught in, right? Because there's always this, how does this affect you internally and how does it affect the external world? Nothing affects only you and nothing affects only the internal world. So we have to manage that. And maybe that's a perennial problem, just having to manage that whole interaction as such.
Okay, I don't know if we want to go into this. Anti-Oedipus capitalism and schizophrenia.
Yeah, that was a reference to the book, or the author that I got a question about there that I didn't read. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, capitalism good, schizophrenia bad. Uh, People are a problem. I don't know. That's how I would summarize that up. Everybody, I have a video on capitalism. Maybe I'll post that link next. Yeah, there's the Lantern Jack talk in case anybody hasn't seen it. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people like to put things in economic frames or in political frames to understand the world. Those are valid frames, but not to understand the world. They're only valid frames to understand some certain things. If you don't know what things they're good for and what things they're bad for, then you're going to get easily enchanted by people telling you, stories like about game A and game B, or stories about how capitalism ruined the world, or whatever. And
Yeah, let me reframe that, because when you pick a frame, you pick it, right? Like when someone else picks a frame for you, like either you have to explicitly agree to it, or you're gonna have to see how that is coloring what they're saying. Because if you're not paying attention to the frame in which people are talking, this was going back to the question of jargon, right? Like, yeah, like jargon, people are talking in jargon, right? And there's implied assumptions within that jargon. So like they might seem to make sense if you use their structure of logic, but like, yeah, maybe you don't want to be in the structure of logic. And it's like, to go to this populism aspect, I think what is populism? Well, populism is, I think, a redefinition of the way that politics is manifest. So if we're having this one mechanism, which is like the press is bringing things up, and then there's this other channel where the politicians have this feedback of their local population, and those are the way that things happen, and then you get Clinton with this disgusting idea of these focus groups where when they get these people together and they bounce ideas of them, and then instead of basing policy on ideals, they start basing policies on basing on this idea of what is the public gonna like, right? And now they call that populism, right? But in some sense, it's just making more efficient what was already happening, right? And I think, and maybe this is the derogatory nature of this idea of populism is, well, when you submit too much to the populace, to the will of the people, and you are not chasing ideals as much anymore, you're gonna corrupt the manifestation of government, because you're relating to
well, your frame's too small, right?
well, yeah, but you're relating to the needs, right? You're not relating to the requirements, but you're relating to the passions, right? Like it's the same.
Well, you're relating to your impression of the needs based on other people's projections of what they think they need.
Right.
So it's way worse, right? It's way worse because it's so far removed from reality. First of all, you don't know what you're up to. And yeah, the way that, I love this comment. I mean, the way the news uses populism just means popular. Right. So the question is, and this is really good. I didn't think about this. This is a good frame. So if your conception of the world is that things are being driven by politics purely, and then you have democracy, so things should be driven in the right way, right? Now, what you don't realize, particularly if you're on, we'll say, the left, right, is that if people don't agree with you, then democracy will prove you wrong. If you think it's all politically driven, then what you're doing by saying populism is you're recognizing democracy disagrees with your point of view, or the majority of the people don't see it your way or something, right? And that's becoming manifest in an interesting way. And what it points to is you think that the political frame should tell everybody everything they need to know to have the views that they need to have to vote the way you expect them to vote. And when they don't do that, you're making up populism because your model of political, understanding of the world fails. It fails to describe the world accurately. So you make up a new word, populism. It doesn't have a meaning outside of democracy. I'm still gonna hold that line. And so that's a problem. And then, that does get us into this comment. I think the limit on freedom being imposed by the state is a little simplistic, but it's not imposed by the state. Nobody said that. Politics is the way we work that out. It's not what's being imposed, right? In the example of the crippled person, that imposition is not imposed by the state, right? It's imposed by a different phenomenon. Sure, but this is the problem. Like, believing that something like the state is the agency that's doing the thing is wrong. Like, it never is. Politics is downstream of culture. Tim Poole used to say this. Carl Benjamin, Sargon Akkad used to say this all the time. Politics is the reflection. It's the thing on the screen at the end after everything's already happened. In other words, the distributed cognition of culture or society, or however you want to frame that, works it out and then tries to get the laws pushed through. And that's a difficult process, and it's messy. And so, for example, you might look in the United States and say, well, people have been, running illegal marijuana growing operations for decades before the laws got passed to legalize it. Yeah, that was happening. So was the government enforcing, people not to? No, it wasn't, right? And then I would argue it should, but that's a different argument. And so that's the problem. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. And then, of course, I like what Father Eric said, which is culture is downstream of religion. Yeah, that's the next step. Let's not jump people too far. They might get into shock, Father Eric, and then they'd panic. But yeah, in fact, that would be my argument, is that religion is inevitable, and that's the foundation that was being talked about earlier that you build the frames on. What foundation are you building your framing on, right? Because it's super important to know what foundation you're actually using to justify your stance in the world, right? Your virtues and your values. And look at this. It's shameless marketing by the Catholic Church. This is why people don't like the Catholic Church. It's too much marketing, damn it. Yeah, it is a problem when people don't reveal their cards, right? And when people will say, the Puritans in New England, when they're private about religion, the problem is now we don't know how tolerant to be. And so everybody in New England gets a little too tolerant over time. And then the next thing you know, there's a bunch of conflict that sort of squirts out on the back end.
So I want to go back to this remark because I again start objecting to the framing, right? Like I think there's a distinction between freedom, which is, I think, something spiritual, and a crippled person, which is a limitation of ability. And a limitation of ability is not a constraint of freedom. Like, I think that's.
No, I think it is. Like, you're not free to run if you don't have legs, or if you only have one leg, right? And that freedom can be restored to some extent, right? Like, you lose a leg, you get
yeah, but I don't think you're free to run. Like you're not free to run if someone is with agency stopping you from running. Like,
yeah, well, it's the confusion of freedom with total freedom to do whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want, which doesn't make any sense, right? Like, freedom has to have a constraint, or there's no contrast. You can't tell what freedom is.
Yeah, so yeah, I've been thinking about this distinction between, well, like there's reality, and I like this new conception of reality is that which objects, right? And then, well, there's natural reality, right? Like gravity says, well, you can't jump higher than so much with this energy expenditure or whatever, right? And then there's a spiritual reality, which is in some sense way more temporally diffuse, although like getting hungry is also something that is temporally diffused. But and it's a step away from the materiality. So there's no real body that we can perceive that holds these constraints, but they're still there. And so when we're relating to material constraints, in some sense they're final. And then when we're talking about spiritual constraints, right, and this is where we get into the idea of adversarial processing or whatever, right? Like there's these trade-offs that happen between, well, if I make society a little bit less free here, then I can get some freedom here, right? So there's this malleable nature to it, right? And then there's these things that you can malleable into that can't persist across long periods of time. And I think this is where we have the discussion about, right? Like there's these patterns that we manifest, but we don't recognize the way that they can persist across time. And
Right.
and the ineffability and the like the nature of the objection of reality changes when it becomes more ineffable.
Yeah, and I want to address this. Yeah, I mean, how people express religion is cultural. That's true, but that's the expression of the religion, not the religion. And see, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because people want to over reduce everything, and so yeah, if religion was downstream from culture, why would certain cultures choose the Protestant Reformation over the Catholics? Did they, or did that happen in spite of the majority of the population not wanting it? Because that happens all the time, right? And so it's not a one-to-one relation. You can't say this happens over here and always causes this downstream, because it's not the world we live in, right? We're the negotiation, we're the mediation between these layers. And so you can say that there's gravity, and we mediate gravity by building planes and helicopters, right? And by going up into space, and like there's all kinds of mediation of gravity that we do. So gravity is not something that always forces, we'll say, a known result, right? It forces a predictable result, but that's different because the prediction is based on what we do. And this is where people get confused, right? This is why Jordan Peterson keeps saying, like, imagine if everything you do mattered. Yeah, because it does, right? And this is where the argument of, well, if there's a scientific possibility for something, it will definitely happen, and therefore we should do it now. That's all lies. It's wrong. It's technically incorrect. It's mathematically wrong. You can calculate it. I promise you, it's been done. There are papers. You can do it yourself. It's not that hard, right? You do it all the time. When you make a decision to do one thing over all the other things, all those other things aren't happening in that moment. And you can argue, well, then you do it, but some things are time dependent. And so some things end up that you'll never be able to do them because you made this one decision. So the idea that doesn't scale is foolish, and of course it does. And so, basically, what ends up happening is that we are the mediators. Culture is the distributed cognition mediator of the things that we interact with. And I like what Father Eric's saying here. Freedom for excellence is not the same as a license to act, right? And there's freedom from and freedom to. And again, we over reduce the idea of freedom, and then it becomes useless to us because we're not making a discernment, right? We're not discerning the simple case, the case in the group versus the case in the individual. There's no discernment there. And discernment's actually a really important concept that we have to sort of bring back into things.
Yeah, and I I have a problem with putting this like people choosing religion, right? So you can make the argument of people choosing religion when Christianity goes into the Roman Empire or something, right? Where it's the individual that is aligning itself with the new, right? But at a certain point, there's an institutional manifestation of the religion, and the institutional so now we're there's a body that's gathered, and that body has in the nation, it has a certain standing, and then there's a political side to the body that is in some sense disconnected from the individuals, right? And then now there's the capacity to have a leadership decision, right? Like, so for Protestantism, there's a leadership decision that steps away from the Catholic Church, and it's not so much something that was born by the people, right? But they were caught up in it, right? Because all of these issues, right? Like, they're highly theological, and like only a small elite is capable of relating to these questions in a healthy way. And then a lot of the issues with the Catholic Church, for example, in the Netherlands, right? They were like done by looters, right? Like they were going into churches to get gold or to get riches, right? Or they were doing it as a political statement against a other political group in the country. There's many ways in which there's a rebellion, and that rebellion might not be against the Catholic Church, but it is getting expression as a as anti-Catholic Church, because that's the spirit that is manifesting in that moment. So the complexity of these things is way bigger than just a
Yeah.
rejection of the
Well,
religion.
I want to point out this comment, right? In the case of a legless person from birth, it's kind of post-democratic or pre-democratic, because notice that a legless person is not a democratic agent when that infringement is being imposed. See, this is a limitation of political framing. If you try to understand things in terms of politics, it will fail, because most of the world is not political. Like, most of the world cannot be understood with political frames, right? There's no democracy in how you're born. Like, evolution is real, and there's certain indications from the fact of evolution, right? And this is where it gets tricky. Like, again, we are mediating potential and actual, right? So in some sense, yeah, we're creating history. Sure, of course, duh. Like, where history is being created, irrespective of our involvement in it, would be probably a better way to say it. But because we're involved in the creation of the here and now, that's a problem. And so when you're in your family and you're not the parent, we'll say, or even if you are one of the parents and not both of the parents, there's no democracy in a family. I mean, this is one of the arguments the communists make all the time. In family groups, communism works. Well, except it's not real. It's not actually communism, but they have a point, even though it's a point on top of their head, because they don't understand something simple, right? Which is that it's easier for small groups to cooperate. And when they cooperate, everybody in the group does better. Yes, that's true. But families also have a head of households, and that head of household is not always the father. Sometimes the mother has a great deal to say about what's going on in the family, sometimes more than the father, and that isn't manifest in the same way, right? So the subtle cues that women give to men that men don't even realize most of the time are really important in shaping what the men do. And you got to take that into account, right? So it's not that simple to say, well, communism works at the family level, and here's how leadership works, and here's how political power works. It's all top down from above. That's a very postmodern narrative. It's wrong. Postmoderns wouldn't know power if it bit them on the ass, because they don't even have a reasonable definition of it that matches reality, right? So when you get stuck in these frames, right, you say, well, it's all really economics, and you can extend economics, and you should extend economics to trade, right? Like, I'll let you vote this way if you let me vote that way, and all of those sorts of things, right? But that's ridiculous, right? So that's the problem, is that it's not as simple as putting it in a political frame or an economic frame or some other frame. Like, there's lots of influences and impacts from lots of different sources, and so your ability to make an independent decision is limited. You're not making independent decisions of other people to begin with. And I like what Father Eric's saying here. Families that work are based on love, but I cannot love communists. Therefore, communists are wrong. I can't argue with the logic there. It sounds perfectly reasonable. I mean, yes, there's a rationality to that is correct.
Yeah, so the Greeks had this distinction where they had their work life, I think it was the religious life, they had the family life, and then they had the polis, right, the political
Mm,
life,
right.
um, right, and
Bunch of
then
identities, by the way.
mhm,
A bunch of identities.
yeah, and then the polis was one of the ways which they could preserve uh, their way of being effectively, right, like
Right.
and well, so I already framed it in a conservative frame there. It's like, yes, there's a preservation of the way of being, and now it seems to have flipped, right? Like there seems to be this implication that the way of being is as a consequence of where we're aiming at, right? Like there's this innovation that constantly needs to happen, right? And uh, yeah, there's this fail forward attitude, right? Like, oh, like we have pollution, so we need to produce more that can contain the pollution, and then like we need to make better things, and we need to make and it's in some sense it's shifting where the cost is being paid, right? So it's like, oh, it's the oil refineries in Africa, right, that are polluting the environment there, or it's the child labor in Asia that is bearing the burden, or whatever, right? Like there's all of these ways where we're just pushing things away, and there's these second order effects effectively, right? Like we're doing something, and then in order for that to be like a whole bunch of conditions need to be met, and we don't realize all the conditions that need to be met when we make the distinction to move forward, even assuming that we're making this decision, right? Because there's a lot of things that just happen. And now I want to go back to to where we started actually, right? Like uh, we make transgressions, and uh, we necessarily have to, right? Like this is in some sense the recapitulation of original sin, right? Like we're fallible creatures, and we can't account for everything.
Well, we have to
So
find the boundaries, and you don't find boundaries unless you move up against them or across them, right? And so there's a transgression in just exploration, which is necessary, right? So we often forget that there aren't two states, a state of rest and a state of action, right? There's different states of action. One is a known action and the other is an unknown action, roughly speaking. Exploration is unknown action, right? It's not the only type of unknown action, but the idea of exploring a space is going to lead to a transgression of some kind. And that's okay. That's why you need to tolerate some transgressions, right? And this gets back to the perennial problem of how much do I tolerate? When do I stop? How much do I tolerate? When do I stop tolerating that much? What things do I never tolerate, right? All of these decision points, they're all difficult. All these discernments. Sorry, Manuel, please go on.
well, yeah, right. So we're making these transgressions, and then sometimes we're like in bed, hopefully we're doing a practice or like prayer, or journaling, or meditation or whatever, right, where we're reflecting upon what we did, but like we might not remember, right, like, or we might be lazy and not do it, or we might even have never heard of that as an option. and and then we build up these transgressions, and it's not even that, right? Like we might also not realize that we're making the transgression, and this is where we started as well, right? Like if we don't get feedback from the people around us, like how do we get the discernment of what is wrong, right? And then we go back to the second order effects, right? So now there's this transgression that happened, right? So now we're not seeing what reality is. We're getting a malformed picture of reality because we're not in right participation, right? And are we able to discern the consequences of this, right? Like, so for example, right, like if I get upset when someone says something to me, and then I get into an argument, and I get angry, right? Like I might assume that that is normal, or that is the only way to relate to the situation, because for me, from my perspective, I don't see an alternative to that happening. And then we start building upon that, right? Like now we take that as an axiomatic assumption, and we start building our coping strategies based upon, okay, that's going to happen. While that is
Right.
not necessary.
Right, and I know Father Eric wasn't here earlier, obviously. Yeah, it's not that you also have to give signals to the people who transgress. We did cover that earlier, but also you're denying the distributed cognition, like the intelligence that is distributed, the ability to discern, right, and the ability to, and therefore the ability to decide when you are not recognizing transgression, when you are not acknowledging, when you're not calling out evil, for example. That's one example. There are many. And that's important because then society loses its sanity, because society loses the ability to discern good behavior from bad behavior, right? Is it okay that somebody do, what is that stupid thing, that storybook hour with transvestites? Like, I don't think that's okay. And is it okay when other people, because I just read this on Twitter, apparently, other people want to do a conservative-based story hour and they're denied? No, I don't think that's okay. Because right, definitely, it's not reciprocal, it's not fair, it's not even, it's not just, right? And so what's really, then it's like, well, what's really going on? Oh, well, the society's insane, technically, right? And therefore, it's not making a distinction between good storybook hour at the library and bad storybook hour at the library, right? There's no discernment there. There's no, because there's too much tolerance. But you can't really do tolerance, right? Because then you can't decide. So it's a trick. When people tell you they're tolerant, what they're saying is, I'm not judging, but then they're not taking action in the world, and they certainly are taking action in the world, so they're lying to themselves, right? They're not necessarily lying to you personally, but they're lying to themselves.
Yeah, and Father Eric is showing us that the Catholic Church is slow to the party, and I think we should stop tolerating that kind of behavior. Like we need them to take action.
Yes, we did not tolerate their slowness. Get on it, church.
Okay, so we're back to boundaries build blueprints direct from poured foundation frames are built on foundations. Make sure there's plumbing and stuff square. So he's really a builder.
But it's good to re-enchant and stop reducing things, right, to things like politics, right, and to say there's a lot of moving pieces, and so you have to have a little bit of grace for when you screw up, and not expect politicians to get it right, not expect voters to get it right, not expect churches to get it right, not expect people to get it right, not expect your parents to get it right or have gotten it right, not expect yourself to get it right, because there's a lot of moving parts. And no matter what you're doing, and I don't care how smart you are, what your IQ is, how smart you think you are, how smart other people tell you are, you're not smart enough to track half of that stuff. You just aren't. Neither am I. Neither is Manuel. Right? You're not tracking that much stuff. I wish you could, but you can't. You're just a limited Muppet like the rest of us Muppets. And we're all Muppets. And it's okay. And look, if Father Eric wants to send out a memo to the Catholic Church, which I highly recommend, then I think that's a good thing, because
Yes.
at least some signal will get out there. And look, it was the only thing that impressed me about the church down the street was, it was decades too late in my opinion, but they actually wrote to Rome and said, we're really concerned about this scandal around the pedophile priests. It's like, well, 25 years too late, but at least you're doing something. I gotta respect that. It really impressed me. So it was. I'm glad that they did something. And then that is how it works. It's one memo at a time. It's one little signal at a time, because of distributed cognition, and the church, all the churches are distributed cognitions, are very slow to move.
Yeah, so I think Father Eric needs to feed the carrier pigeons, because else they might get distracted en route, and then they will be even later.
Yes, if you send the memo via carrier pigeon, it will have more weight for sure. And that is actually technically true, right? How the message gets to you really matters. How often you see the message really matters. People often get fooled by, well, I hear this every day, it must be common. The number of people I know that are coming to me panicking, and have been panicking for the past 2.5 years over the same stuff. It's like, I understand that you hear that a lot, but it's 4 people who are very loud. I promise you, it's literally 4 people. Don't worry about it. They're going to be loud for a while. Ignore them. Ignore that signal. It's a bad signal. It's a signal that they want very badly, which is why they're loud. But they're not. It's not going to happen. So
Yeah, and maybe if we write the memo on a piece of golden paper, right, or we nail the
yep,
memo on the door of the church, right? Like there's many ways to highlight this message and have it gain more status in some sense, right? So yeah, so if we bring that back into these transgressions, right? Like we need some way to highlight these transgressions to ourselves, right? Like to lift them up from all of this noise effectively of all these other things, and I think this is where the ecology of practices is gonna jump in. There's a way in which we can be intentional about our relationship to ourselves, to the people around us, that stops the clutter from cluttering.
right. Well, you rely on the distributed cognition, right? Like if I need to know something about Plato, I'm not going to ask myself because I don't, I'm not a Plato expert. But I might ask Dr. Landry Jack, who has an excellent channel, and he would know and he would answer me because he's awesome. But I wanted to highlight this. Then how come they have it's a story hour, but we can't? Yeah, it's an interesting idea. There's some kind of egalitarian notions. No, there isn't. It's not a justice issue, right? This is the problem. Is that when you try to fit things into a legal frame or a political frame or both or an economic frame, you're going to fail to understand that individual towns with individual libraries, and they may have more than one, have individual decision makers at that layer of reality making individual decisions. Now, can it rise to the courts? It can. It probably will in that particular case. I got a feeling about this. So I'll just give you an example story. So here's a true story of what happened in Massachusetts. Massachusetts years and years ago, probably maybe even 20 years ago, now I forget how long ago it was, they passed a law that basically said you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex, right? The purpose of the law was to make sure that men's only clubs weren't allowed. That was the purpose of the law. It was stated by the evil people, I would say, who did it. This is what they wanted. That's what they stated. But the law that got passed said you could not discriminate. You couldn't have an organization or a club that discriminated on the basis of sex at all in the state of Massachusetts ever. Okay, so what happened is, because it's Massachusetts and the weirdest things happen in Massachusetts, you wouldn't even imagine. Like you cannot imagine. Even if you live there, you probably don't know, 1/10 of the weird things that go on in the courts in particular. Some guy had a women's only gym because they had women's only gyms all over the place. There were no male only gyms in Massachusetts because they would get shut down immediately. But women's only gyms never got shut down because women are sacred and everybody knows that. And no fool would be foolish enough to shut down a women's only gym, despite the law. So everybody's ignoring the law, literally in the whole state of Massachusetts. I'm not joking. This actually happened. So some smart, I think it was a Jewish lawyer out of Newton or Wellesley or one of the wealthy towns with too much time on his hands, and he was wealthy. He lived in a wealthy town. Decided that the closest gym to him was a women's only gym, and he was going to sue. So he sues, and he wins. And eventually, they had to let him into the stupid gym. And I'm of two minds. On the one hand, yay, the law got upheld. And on the other hand, no, it was such a stupid law. It never should have been passed, right? And so these little inconsistencies happen all over the place. And it's only this reduction, this desire. Well, if the federal government would just say everybody has to wear masks and everybody would wear masks, yeah, how'd that work out? It didn't. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Not even half the people wore masks. All the idiots in the cities, maybe. But everybody, which is, not all the people, everybody outside the cities wasn't wearing masks. I changed where I shopped for groceries because they had a citywide ordinance. We didn't have a statewide ordinance in South Carolina. They had a citywide ordinance, so I stopped going to the city and just went to the closer grocery store that had less food that I wanted. But whatever, I can survive on rice and beans. I can do the Epicurean thing. So that's the problem, is that justice isn't this fast thing that reacts immediately, just like the church isn't this fast thing that reacts immediately to everything that you see, because you see more than it does. Like The justice system, the political system, only sees things when people make a big deal of them. And that process takes a long time because you can get into negotiations with people. People can tell you no, they can stonewall you for months. I've have been involved in lawsuits. I've been an expert witness in a lawsuit. These things take a long time, even though to me it's like 10 minutes. Do you have the documents? No. Okay, moving on. You lose. Right? Any idiot would look at the case and go, "This case takes 10 minutes." Right? But it never does. The courts are always like, "Oh, I have to come here 5 times for no reason other than to say 2 words, and then I'll go home and come back in a month or 6 months or whatever." The courts are ridiculously inefficient. Like, go spend the day at the court. They'll let you just come in and watch. For most things, you can just watch the court be completely insane and ridiculous. I got a buddy who goes to court all the time, and whenever I'm up in New England, he's like, "Oh, come on, you're going to go down to the courthouse." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, this is going to be fun." And the only reason why he wants me to go is because when he goes, he wins. And he wins every single case. It's unbelievable. But he's also very well organized, and he knows the people. And yeah, I mean, I like what Father Eric said here. Inefficiency is a feature, not a bug, because you don't want to make large changes too quickly. And so the larger systems, the distributed cognitions that are above us, are very slow to change because that's important. It's not like, oh, we should instantly be able to make everybody wear masks because some president said so, or some premier said so, or some parliament passed some law, right? You've got to give people time to adjust, right? Because you can't just implement it tomorrow and start going after businesses, because it just takes time to do these things. But also you don't want to, because how else do you find out if you're wrong if things happen instantly? And so it's a good point.
I want to bring back tolerance in here, because I think if we look at tolerance from this framing, it's like a way to take load of the system, right? So there's this slow moving system that has high implications and therefore should be wielded with care, and also like there's limited resources, right? So it should also have a high level of relevance realization. It should only relate to things that are really important, and not so much to the lesser things, although they might be bad, right? And
important to that layer of reality, right? So one of the things that people don't understand is that when governments talk about inflation, they aren't talking about the inflation that you feel in your pocketbook, because governments, their fundamental job is not to make you comfortable. It's to make it so that you have affordances, so that you're able to do things, right? But the government's job is to manage the price of commodities for businesses. So when they measure inflation, they measure things like commodity price. Commodity price of wheat and corn doesn't affect me because it doesn't go up and down that much. I mean, it can, but largely those fluctuations I never see, because they get absorbed by the grocery store, by the people delivering the food, by the people growing the food, by the people processing the food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those things that are happening at that level that I never see, because I only care when I go to the grocery store how much my food costs. The government doesn't care about your grocery store bill, but they do care about that middle place. So I just wanted to put that little caveat in there. It's not that they're looking at relevance. They're looking at relevance at a specific layer, because relevance at that layer and relevance at the layer below it and relevance at the layer above it may be related, but you can't adjust all 3 at the same time. And so you have to adjust one and see how the other 2 are affected. Sorry, Manuel, please continue.
Right. Well, and so if you take that analogy to the body, right? Like there's things that happen to your toenail that that are annoying to your toenail, right? And maybe there needs to be some antibodies that go there or whatever, right? But at a certain point, you get the signal of pain, right? Like the signal of pain is the thing that brings in the attention of the head and says, oh, like I now need to go onto this part of the body. I need to have an executive decision, right? Like maybe I need to clean my feet. Maybe I need to put a bandage on. Maybe I need to go to the doctor, right? And going to the doctor is, again, a higher level of escalation, because now your whole body needs to participate in a project that will just serve the functioning of the foot, right? So there's and then the tolerance thing is letting these things, right? Like, oh, like my food is annoying me, right? But I don't have time to go to the doctor. Like that's like I have to do whatever because like that is of immediate importance, right? And then a lot of these things they will just resolve themselves across time, right? And there will be a cost associated to that, right? Like you might have bad sleep as a consequence of your foot hurting for a while. Uh, like you might not be able to walk as properly as you could, right? And these things could have been resolved, but they get that cost get carried by you in favor of manifesting something else. So now we're again talking about trade-offs and what are the values that we're striving for, right? And then there's this thing, right, where you might ignore your foot once, maybe you might ignore it twice, but if you have a chronic problem, like there's the reason why chronic problems are a special category in in the healthcare industry, right? Like then you're changing the way that you're living your life as a consequence of the endurance of the problem, right? So you might look at it one way, right? Like when when your feet is hurting all the time, you start favoring your leg, right? And then when you start favoring your leg, you start walking a little bit sideways, and now
You hurt
your
your
spine
hips,
is
and then you hurt your
going.
lower back, and then you hurt your neck. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All
So
right,
yeah, that's
Chad's
the
here.
process that we're talking about.
Let's find out what Chad has to say about all this. What do you think, Chad?
Uh, when you guys were talking about law stuff, I was reminded of when COVID first went down, um, and like the whatever the lockdowns or whatever, we had to wear masks and stuff. Um, my wife and I had to get a piece of paper notarized. I think for our wedding, it might have been
Mhm.
like my I don't know. I don't remember which paper it was, but it needed to get notarized. So we go to this place. It was a UPS store, and and we go in there, and I have it. We all have our masks on, and and she's like, "Well, do you have your ID?" And I said, "Yes." So I give her my ID. Well, my identification card had been what's the word? Uh,
Expired?
expired. Yeah, for like a month or two. And she's like, "I'm sorry, I can't use this. Do you have anything else?" And so I go and I'm like, "I have my union card
Mhm.
identification." And when they took the picture, I never thought I'd ever use this card. I just made like a stupid, goofy face on it, you know. And so she's like, "That'll work." And she takes the card and she uses it. But you know what she never did? She never asked to see my face.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. No, I know. Well, yeah, and that's the problem. The government can ask for something, right? But the ability for people to implement it is a different question, and it has to be implemented by someone somewhere. And not everyone's capable of doing all the same things, and not everybody does the same things in the same way. And so that's part of the problem is that this top-down power from above narrative doesn't work because it doesn't work. Like there isn't a single entity doing all the things.
It was hilarious. So it's like, wait, so you're going to give me trouble because my driver's license is invalid, and you're going to take a piece of identification that is not a government identification, and you're going to accept that and not look at my face.
Right. Right,
It's
right,
like
right, right. But they don't see that. Like you thought it all through because you're able to. But most people aren't able to see things like that. And that's the problem. We don't appreciate how difficult thinking is and how hard it is for people to engage. And then when you notice something that somebody else doesn't notice, irrespective of your intelligence or IQ or anything, right? Because look, you can argue that Brett Weinstein never paid any attention to politics, and so his ideas of politics are about equivalent to a 4-year-old's, literally, right? Because that happened. Like some of the stuff he describes, I'm like, dude, you need to read the Federalist Papers. The way you're describing the way government should work is actually what they wrote about in the Federalist Papers. You're just re-describing and rediscovering something that people already discovered. He doesn't know he's ignorant of that, right? He just thinks he has a solution to what he perceives as a problem. Right, and then like, he's a smart guy. Like he has a very high IQ and he's very well read. He's just not very well read in politics. And we all have that. Like we all have our limitations of relevance, our limitations of attention, our limitations of awareness, our limitations of information, and our limitations of what knowledge we have access to, right, or can generate for ourselves.
So, Grizz brought up something. I can't remember who he talked with, but it was like I can't remember which amendment it was or whatever. Maybe it's in the Constitution about how if something gets out of whack, it's up to the responsibility of the people to change things or change. I can't remember. See, this is how uneducated I am. I don't know how many other people are uneducated around the Constitution, but like, do you know what I'm talking about? Which part is that in the Constitution where it talks about basically taking the system down and starting over, and when things get out of balance, or I can't remember.
No, it's supposed to self-adjust. You don't tear it down. There's nothing about tearing it down. There was I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said we should have a revolution every 80 years or something crazy, right? But even the idea of revolution in the United States is different from what people conceive of, right? It's not tear down the government. That's anarchy.
Yeah, no, it's the fourth. I can't remember what it is. But yeah, I was wondering about that, and like, I don't know. I have to pump some gas. I'm listening right now.
Yeah, there's nothing preventing us from changing the system. That's the strength in the United States of the US system, right? It's the way that it changes. Because you can change the European systems pretty easily too, right? It's just a different mechanism. And I think people get confused. And I think that I mean, bringing back the framing on this story time egalitarianism issue, it's not egalitarianism that's at play, right? It's equality as such, right? It's equal treatment or equal opportunity, right? Egalitarianism isn't equal opportunity. That's not what it is. And so you can frame the issue any way you want, right? But if people don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. This is the problem, right? The right frame is to say that there is a spirit afoot that doesn't want people to engage and equally, right? They're not down for the equality. They may say they are. And this goes back to the problem. People say things all the time that aren't true about themselves, like constantly. It happens. Everybody does it. We all do it. We're all Muppets. It happens. And we don't recognize.
I don't do that.
Except Manuel, right? Because he's really a robot spider built by Sally Joe. So we all know that.
I have nets and I can capture you.
Exactly.
I'm really wondering what people think about this weird guy wearing a mask with a hole in it, standing at the gas pump in the middle of the city.
I think he's pretty freaky.
Yeah, didn't they do something like that in some cartoon? It reminds me of.
Yeah, you want to hit up one of these comments here, Manuel?
Yeah, I think this is the one that summarizes it. So there's this idea that we can't talk about examples in history and say that it can happen now. And well, in some sense, that is obviously true, right? Like
it can happen exactly the same way, right? But history rhymes if not repeats. So also no.
Yeah. So there is an element where there's a bunch of specifics that are necessary for something to happen, but you can also talk about history in a different way, where there's different forces or different spirits that come together, right? And then if you start seeing the world in that way, then you can say, well, okay, then there's a limited way for that energy to disperse, right? And so one of them can be in separation, right? Like one of them can be in conflict, like one of them can be in uh, recapturing that energy into something productive, right? Like there's all of these ways, and then the specifics of the situation, they are gonna decide, right, or define the fields that these energies can manifest through. And then there's going to be individuals that will redirect that energy into one direction or the other direction, right? So all of these things, they come together, and then that is how things happen. And so you, in some sense, you can say no, like we can't take these things from the past and apply them to the present. But in another sense, yes, right? And then what you have to realize is that there's a level of certainty, right? Like you're talking not with certainty, but you're talking about tendencies instead.
Yeah, well, and it's the modern
That's
snobbery
wisdom.
that everything's different. That is obviously false. Like everything is not different. A lot of the patterns that unfolded in the past are going to unfold again. And I think that's one of the things that people miss. They go, "Oh, look at the past 50 years has been great." It's like, well, yeah, but if you go back 100, it hasn't, and you can see these patterns over time. So that's part of the problem. Is that when you're not engaging correctly with the patterns, you can always say, well, the implementation is different and therefore it's different. But actually, it's not different. Like, we're not different people fundamentally. We're not more rational. We're not more intelligent on average. None of that stuff is true, and none of it's backed up by any data at all, right? Just people like to say it over and over and over again so that they believe it. But it's not. There's a story too that I like to tell. So the British Museum has a YouTube channel. And on that YouTube channel, there's a guy named Irving Finkel, I think it is. But anyway, he's the director of antiquities or something like that, or he was. And he tells this story about the world's oldest game, which is not a game from Egypt. It's not Senet like I thought. It was this game called we now call it the Royal Game of Ur. And he says, well, the first time they found this game, they found one of these games intact. They were surprised that there was a drawer in the bottom of the game to hold the game pieces. And I'm like, why would anybody be surprised about that? Did they think the people that lived 5,000 or 6,000 years ago were retarded? Are they stupid? Like, they weren't stupid. Of course they knew how to build drawers and put drawers for pieces. Like, they're not dumb. Like, why would you assume that? But we have this snobbery about the modern era, mostly based on the fact that we're standing on the shoulders, not just of giants, but of average folk and folk that are lesser than us, right? That built the past, that we now built our present upon, right? And those people had many of the same concerns, many of the same problems, many of the same philosophies, many of the same religious traditions, and many of the same struggles. And we're just not recognizing that.
Well, yeah. Now that brings up this whole thing about, I think, one of the most difficult things that modern people will do is accept their averageness. It's like,
right.
It's so, like, it's like, for me, that's one of my primary aims. Can I just be okay with being average? And the more I move into that, like, the more freedom I feel, and yeah, that's absurd. Like,
yeah, and
hubris is ridiculous.
Well, and I think what that leads to is precisely the problem that people have, which is they go, you know what, I can understand the world. My forefathers couldn't really understand what was going on, which is why, casting things in history is dangerous, because sometimes people didn't see it that way and you're just wrong about your historical conclusions, right? But I can come up with a frame to understand the world, and I'm just going to use politics, and I'm going to say the government controls everything, which is so obvious BS. The past 2.5 years hasn't proven anything to you other than the government has very little control. Any government anywhere in the world, very little control of their population. I don't know what to tell you. Masks weren't a thing in my state except for 90 days. Florida never did masks, or maybe they did them for a month or something. South Dakota never did masks. Like the federal government put a mask mandate in place and everybody pretty much ignored it. Like not everybody, but the vast majority of people ignored it, right? Like the control the government has is zero, basically, right? When the government does not reflect the people, there's a mismatch, and then they have to use force. But the government is a tiny percentage of the population. So their ability to use force is limited, right? This is all good news, by the way. You're not controlled by your government. You have a great deal of control over the government.
So I want to respond with this, right? Like, because we're talking about tolerance effectively. And I think what is happening is people are over tolerant to everything. And part of the thing that they're tolerant towards is the government. Now, that manifests in the way that the government does a thing and they don't get a lot of opposition. But that doesn't mean that people are actually complying with what the government is doing or that they're agreeing with it, right? Like what's going on is they're at a place where avoiding the conflict or being part of the herd is being privileged over rebellion. And I think this is a consequence of affluence, right? Because if you're affluent, then you don't need to protect the things that you have in the same way as when you're not, right? Because you can find alternative means, right? So it's like, well, like I don't want to wear a mask, so like I'm not going to go to the pub drinking with a mask because that's silly, so I'm just going to watch Netflix, right? Like if you don't have Netflix, then that is a different decision, right? And so I don't think that the government is actually exerting control, but yeah, like there's this idea, right? Like that this recent generations, they're not properly in alignment to, well, yeah, you call them philosophical aspects, but I would argue that they're probably more religious aspects, right? Like where do you base your actions upon, right? And if you don't have a source of justification for your actions, right? Like you're going to place it in politics or in science, true politics or true science in politics, like one of those ways you're gonna
Well,
do it.
really, it's all rooted in self-centeredness. It's like, yeah, the government doesn't need to have control when they weaponize, uh, like something like your lack of virtue. So like the other's lack of virtue, I guess. So like it's convenient when it's convenient. It's like that. It's like the guy that you said there that sued that woman's gym. It was like it was convenient for him to do. Like that's you don't need a government to be have top down, but you can just put something like that in place so people can weaponize something like that, like at the snap of the fingers. And like another thing to remember, it's like what I think is really interesting is we live in a world today that is, I think, unlike anything that we've ever even come close to experiencing. I mean, everyday people have like the greatest library that one could ever imagine in the ancient world in the palm of our hands. I mean, like you think about that, every idiot has it, myself included. And like, and I don't even know, like, there's so much that goes along with that. It's like I remember I refused to use Google Maps or MapQuest or any of that stuff for years up until like maybe only 5 years ago, and now it's like now I can't even like I need MapQuest to go somewhere now. You know what I mean? And so I think about all of that stuff is kind of intertwined. I know I'm all over the place, but there's all of this is intertwined. It's like this other level of affluence
Well,
where it's like
yeah, it is.
it's like intellectual affluence or something, where it's
Right.
like pseudo intellectualism,
Yeah,
and we're all
the snobbery of elevation of intelligence, whatever that is, and it is undefined, which is interesting.
it's a mask of intelligence because
Right,
it's not my intelligence.
Right, but that gives us the concept that we can understand things about the world. And then when we try, we come up with small frames like politics or like economics or like generations or, these tiny frames. And then we try to fit the whole world into them. And then when our predictions are
That's
wrong,
that
we get.
middle out shit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it leads to the middle out thinking for sure. Yeah, if you haven't seen my video, middle
Right,
out thinking,
because
I
at the
now look
bottom
at
of all of
patterns.
it's at the bottom of all of it really is even like a self. I think it's a self-centered philosophy, and where the self is at the center. If you have that kind of philosophy, a thing like tolerance is a weapon. So like it's not like true tolerance. It should
Mhm.
be a tool used with wisdom, just like
Right,
discernment. All those different things
right.
are all like. And if you're in a room by yourself and you never actually are in the world amongst people, you practice a self-centered philosophy where it's
Mhm.
all just thinking, 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 like and then you have amplified voice where you can go on places like Twitter. Any idiot can be a reporter, with and it's like, ugh, it's just yeah, just like me right now. Like I have no idea what I'm talking about. I think I'm onto something, but I'm not exactly sure.
No, yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, you're tying a bunch of threads together, and this is the conceit that we have: is that the world is very complex, and you really do need to rely on distributed cognition to get through the world. Like you don't actually have a choice. When you try, you will fail. You'll go after a guru, or you'll start listening to a particular news outlet, or you'll grab somebody on YouTube or a bunch of people on YouTube, and you'll try to put them together yourself, right? And then that just leads to confusion and frustration because your predictions about how the world should unfold are, keep being incorrect, like in a substantial way. And it really is that lie of intelligence, roughly speaking, and how much we tell people they have in terms of how intelligent are you? It's like, well, you're not smart enough to do most of these things. And that's why distributed cognition is important. And that's why you have to rely on it. It's not an optional thing. You're not free to say, I'm giving up on all distributed cognition whatsoever. And I'm not going to have access to this anymore. Like, you're embedded in it. You don't have a choice.
So to go back to this idea of having a library in your pocket, right? Like, well, what was a library before the printing press, right? Like, a library was a place where they gathered books, right? So first of all, someone had to create the book, right? So that was a big investment.
A
So
lot of people.
that, yeah, so creating a book is already a barrier to entry, right? And then they have to gather the book from somewhere, and they have to want it, and they have to upkeep it, right? So someone has to value the book as well as the person has to value the book in order to create it, right? And and then they get organized in a place, right, in the library, so they get stacked in relation to each other due to relevance, right? Like so there's all of these filters that happen that select the knowledge that is appropriate from knowledge that is less appropriate, and we don't have that on the internet, right? Like
Yeah, and they would make sure that not every idiot got into the library
that
because
as
they'll
well,
burn
yeah,
it
that
down.
as well, right? So there's a forbidden knowledge aspect as well, right? Like, oh, in order to properly relate to this content, you need to first know these things, and yeah, like that barrier is also removed on the internet. So
Right. Well, I think yeah, we should address this. I like this comment from Nahama. In my view, the smartphone automatically obliterated the previously automatic boundaries discernment between work, home, government, and God. Now everything is up for question at any point in time. And I would modify that slightly. I would say it didn't obliterate the boundaries, but it allowed you to do that. In other words, it affords tolerance, right? And this is to the point. There's too much tolerance in the world, right? There's too much tolerance available to us, and making just decisions, right? Making judgments, which requires discernment. All of these processes: discernment, decision, judgment, and decisions. are cognitively difficult. They require a lot of hard thought, and thought takes a lot of energy out of us, and so we don't
It's
want
not
to
tolerance,
do it.
though.
Well, it is, but it is tolerance. Like not
Yeah,
wanting
it's
to
not.
decide about.
We're not talking about tolerance. You're talking about. We're talking about social bypassing. It's not tolerance. Tolerance requires a real relation, and
No,
like to.
tolerance is the destruction
That's
of a
what
relation.
what you're talking about is you're wiping a you're like a social bypassing. Like I don't agree with it, so I'm not going to look at all, or they're idiots, and so I shut my ears. And
That's one side effect of it, Chad. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
I
the
don't, but
ability to be tolerant.
yeah, but that's not the ability to be tolerant and to actually be tolerant takes wisdom, and there's a real lack of that, and I don't think that what we're actually talking about is tolerance. It's
No, the
like I
ability.
said, it's some sort of bypass.
No, the ability to be tolerant requires nothing. The ability to do tolerance correctly requires wisdom. And that's the problem, is that people are too easily able to be tolerant. And so they are being too tolerant and tolerant towards the wrong things. And then you get this stupid story hour problem. You get these other problems where people are okay telling other people to wear masks. And you get all of these other second order effects from all of that, because people are too used to being too tolerant about too many things, and they're able to do it because of some of this technology. And it's not to
Right,
blame
and
people, it's not
and
to blame people.
and I can link tolerance to virtue, because if you treat tolerance as a virtue, right, like now there's an imperative to express the tolerance, right, and I think that's what happens with the story arc, right, like there's an imperative to include those on the outside, right, because that's what you should do, right, because there's there's yeah, Peugeot talks about this flip, right? Like there's been this confusion, right, where we're privileging. We're no longer seeing the boundaries, and now so the imposition of the boundaries is gonna cause stress, and therefore is associated with evil, right? Like there's a negativity that is implicit in and this is related to our feelings, right? So what is tolerance doing, right? Like it's privileging peace, right? So or the maintenance of peace, right? And it's no longer recognizing that if you tolerate things too long, peace cannot exist anymore, because now you have built up too much energy, too much tension uh, for these things to be stable anymore.
Yeah, you're not correcting in the
I,
moment, right? You're
I'm
not
gonna
doing
I'm gonna start
the
I'm gonna start
correction.
roboting really quick. I'm gonna start roboting quick. I want to say something quick before I have to kind of be quiet. So like and tolerance, like in machining, tolerance is like the space between how far something, like when you machine a tool or something, you only have a little bit of tolerance, and if you can't go outside of those numbers, so that's what I mean by tolerance. Tolerance is within boundaries. Now, if you throw that, what's happened is the measuring tool has gotten so far out of whack. Now we're not in the land of tolerance. We're in the land of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So keep that in mind that's how I understand tolerance. It's like there is understood, again, like the foundations thing, right? Like we understand what foundations we're on. Now, if we're in the desert, there's no foundations. You can't have tolerance out there, So that's what I mean by tolerance.
Yeah, well, look, there's an aspect of being able to measure tolerance, but there's also an aspect of making it universal, right? Which is where you have a measurement, but you're ignoring that measurement. And you're saying, well, I know this person transgressed, but I'm not going to do anything about it. I think that's a fair way to think about it. And that's where the problem comes in. People don't want to admit that, yeah, we have too much stuff. It's too easy for us to avoid conflict. And rather than learning to conflict, learning to interface in a conflicting manner with people, we are allowing people to to not do that, right? And then they don't have the skill anymore, and everybody else doesn't have the signaling that's required, and that's a problem. It's actually a huge problem. Yeah, interesting.
Well,
Ugh, trolls. Trolls are no good. Being attacked by trolls in the studio.
being childish. Congratulations. So yeah, like we seem to have a new generation of people that can't participate correctly with other people, and
Right. Well, then
they
we're too tolerant of them. We should throw them off the internet entirely, which we could do technically. Actually, I'm a little surprised that Google isn't on that. They could do a lot better job. And that is, I mean, again, this is part of the enablement of tolerance, right? It's too easy to let everybody do whatever they want, whenever they want. It's too easy to let people join chats and join live streams, and it's very hard for one or even two people to sort of figure out, well, what are we doing, right? And how do we do it, right? And that's why I like the rule of no camera, no, you're not going to be here, right? And then you got to put your camera up first so we can see who and what you are, so you're not spamming the channel, because it's too easy to do. The barrier to entry is 0, and barriers to entry are annoying, but they serve a filtering purpose, and filtering is part of tolerance. Like, if you're not filtering for bad actors, you're going to end up not being able to get rid of the bad actors, because they're just going to keep coming. And they're very persistent, and they know how to do interesting things, but I don't think they're who they say they are at this point. Oh, poor Nick feels discriminated against. Well, we're discriminating against you, so that's too bad. If we could validate who you were, that would be different. But actually, there's a problem with validating people while they're sitting in the waiting area of the studio. And apparently you can fake the names, which I didn't realize. So you can appear to be somebody who you're not. It's like, very tricky. But that level of filtering is required. And when we're not filtering, you're running into problems. It's funny that we run into the tolerance problem right here.
yeah, Paul. I think I made that comment that cigarette hole has some connotations in our culture that are of a sexual nature or of a more horror-like nature.
Well, I like what Joey said here, right? When you stop realizing you're in a filtered environment, you start thinking socialism works in other silly beliefs. Exactly. Well, and the thing is, 0 of these people want to be in an unfiltered environment, right? Because they want to take advantage of your rules so that they can gain some control over the situation or exert some force over the situation, right? And you'll notice I didn't use the P word there. Because basically I don't believe it's appropriate, right? It's not power. It's a whole different kettle of fish. And I think that is the important part, is when we fail to filter, when we have too much tolerance, we're letting too much stuff in, and then you have bad effects left, right, and center. And it's been a big problem in online platforms in particular. Hey, Chad, welcome back.
I resent that comment about the hole in my mask.
You're not being very tolerant right now, Chad.
I like to aim towards things. I'm not too attached to results. Okay.
There we go. Well, that's good. That's what you need to be, right? You need to aim for things and not worry about the lions coming to eat you, because the lions are coming to eat you. So
There ain't no way around that. Paul Vanderclay calling out my nightmarish holy mask with smoke in it.
Holy mask.
He's got a holy mask, and the pastor doesn't like it. It's a little suspicious. Is he a real pastor? I have my doubts.
This mask is the icon of worshipping cigarettes. Okay, like he's right. This is not tolerable under any church standard.
The mask is going to be the vestments of the future.
Of the future. You can drink your Slurpee through it.
Hey, think about this. Think about this. The masks were typically used before the COVID thing in hospitals, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The hospital is the church, the modern church. And how do we venerate the hospital? We're all made to wear masks.
That's interesting framing. I think this is a good example of where framing can lead you astray. But yes, I actually rather like that.
I like meta framing.
Don't do this, Chad. No, Paul has to put this on this video again.
Was that Paul who was bombing this chat or this video link?
Definitely it was.
Definitely, we've now seen explicit pictures.
He's exactly that kind of troll. No, somehow I don't think so.
Yeah, but like we can't filter the trolling of Paul Vanderklay. Like we can't even filter that. Like
I thought that guy was fired.
That may be. I don't think we really are going down that line.
Well, he was just laid off.
There's no reason to fire Paul from anything, despite what Jacob may feel. But yeah, it's all fine. Everything's fine.
The only fire that Paul needs to deal with is the fire of purification.
That's right. That's right. The holy fire of purification, indeed. I wonder if the Protestants have such a concept.
Well, no, because then they wouldn't protest anymore.
They're too tolerant. Maybe that's what's driving their protest is the fire of purification. They're constantly trying to purify the church, even though it's mostly already accomplished. We'll say, as Father Eric might say. I don't know.
Well, do me a favor here once. So, like, you made this distinction about the protest, right? It's for something, right? Yes. So, what is the Protestant in that frame?
A mislabeling.
Yeah.
Well, I think Luther's original protest was a valid protest. I think. I mean, I'm not. This is way out of my lane here, but I think it was a valid protest. I think the problem, and Luther said this. Like Luther wrote about this. Like what he did was a mistake. He realized that later because it caused a lot of death, and it was it wasn't like the Catholic Church fought back and slaughtered all the. It wasn't a one-way thing. It was and Protestants were fighting Protestants, and it was a mess. And Luther saw all that and was like, oh no, I shouldn't have done that stupid nailing of the thing to the door, right? Where it led, right? Because you don't know where things are going to lead.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's a lot of that's out of his hands. Like, so just because you hammer some 95 theses to a door doesn't mean some asshole down the street isn't going to take and print a bunch of this stuff.
Right. Well, it's are you going to take it to heart? Right? That's the first discernment, and then what are you going to do about it? And there's lots of things you could do about it. So this is a good question. Could you be unintentionally or intentionally advocating for intolerant bubbles? Well, no, I'm not advocating for bubbles. Because what is a quote bad according to one bubble is different from what is good. Yeah, look, these are perennial problems. Like, your idea of bad and my idea of bad are going to be different. And one of us is going to be more or less correct in some frame, and in another frame, it'll be the opposite. Like, that's going to happen. These are not straightforward problems. You can't just sit there and say, I know we'll all be tolerant to a level of 4. That's the tolerance level we need. And if we're all 4 tolerant, you can't do that. It's not a universal. That's why we're working it out through government, through the religion, right? By making these changes. Protestantism, I'm sure Pastor Paul would love to hear this. Protestantism did some great things and fixed a bunch of bad stuff in the Catholic Church, for sure, right? Does that justify all the death? That's a tougher question, right? The Protestants better believe the answer is yes, by the way. But whatever, like, I don't have an opinion on any of that. I'm just saying there's lots of considerations. You can't just boil this stuff down. And it's not about bubbles. We are all in bubbles and always will be because our cognition is limited. and we have to pick which groups we need to be part of or are going to be part of, and which groups we're going to exclude, right? We can't have full tolerance for everything because we can't track everything. We can't even track a lot of things. The Dunbar number is allegedly what, 150? And you can argue, well, the Dunbar number over time is 1,000. Yeah, maybe. I don't care. It doesn't matter. The things you
So
can
you're
track.
saying so the tolerance between the Dunbar number now is between 150 and 1,000.
No,
Well,
no,
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 like,
no, I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying that
don't take it seriously. The Dunbar number is just to say that there's a limitation to what you can deal with. Like, that's
well,
all
and
it's
there's
saying.
there's two
Same thing with
limitations.
tolerance.
But there's two important limitations. There's the limitation of what you can do in the moment. In other words, how many friends can you actually call? It's not 1,000, right? You can't call 1,000 people every month, or most people can't. So are they your friends? But over the course of your life, have you had 1,000 friends that you called? Of course you have. Like, like that's not, or of course it's possible, right? And that's the problem, is that we're not accounting for time and history and future. We're not even thinking about these things.
And
It's a valid point.
I want to talk about these bubbles, right? So first of all, right, like when we talk about bubbles, we're effectively talking about structures without structure or something, right? Like, which is again really Protestant way of being, right? Like, oh, we don't want to build this constriction around about this identity that I have, because that's what a bubble is, right? Like, it's a shared identity, and so when you have a shared identity, you need to protect that identity from the outside, because if there's too much influence from the outside, it's going to lose its identity because it's going to become something else, right? So there needs to be an integration process, like there needs to be a shielding from the outside, and then there needs to be a permeation of a boundary from the outside, and like all of this stuff is necessary. And depending on what point in time for the same bubble, those things are going to change. Like, so even for the same bubble, like, this is not a permanent condition. And then, well, these bubbles have different functionalities. So the fact that they're having a different functionality means that they should have different shielding from the outside and different coherence of identity, right? Like how strong do I need to maintain that identity in relation to my other identities, right? Like, so for example, if you're a father or a mother, it's really, really important to maintain that identity, else your child is going to starve, right? Like that it's not an option to release yourself from that identity for an extended period of time. And so, like, all of this bubble stuff, it's like, no, it's healthy to have bubbles, right? And so the problem with bubbles is, if you take the rules from inside the bubble to the outside of the bubble and expect people to cohere to those rules, right? Because now you're transgressing with your impositions of the norms and values that you want to relate to the world with. Like, you at that point, you lose the authority, right? Like, there's a
But I want to focus on this, because actually Bazzini has a perfect example. The Green Bay Packers fan club is intolerant of Bears fans. No one sees a problem with that, right? So we keep focusing on, well, bubbles are a problem. No, bubbles are not a problem. Right? There are problems with bubbles, which are inevitable, because bubbles are inevitable, right? But not all the things about bubbles are bad. And this is where we get stuck. We see a bad thing, and therefore we must eliminate. That's purity or purification, or it's puritanical thinking, right? And it's wrapped up in perfection. We're not living in a perfect world, and we're not perfect people. So the idea that we're going to be living in a perfect world is nonsense. So you can't have perfection as your standard. You have to have some discernment around what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not willing to tolerate. And because things have to change, right? But that is the problem. There are plenty of bubbles that are positive. Sports bubbles are an excellent example. Like that level of conflict where you have Boston versus New York, which is probably the most famous, right? That is wrapped up in a history that goes all the way back before the country was a country. Like literally, this is just the Puritans hating on the Dutch at the end of the day, right? And then they had a more of an excuse when the stupid Dutch people got wealthy when they dredged their harbor in the late 1800s, right? And then that caused more wealth than has ever been caused on the planet before or since, by the way, right? That was the golden age, the robber barons, all that. That was in conflict with Boston because before that, the wealthiest man in North America was John Hancock, right? It was right. All the money was in Boston until right. So now there's more reason to hate New York City. The nouveau riche, that's where that comes from, right? And now that tension gets resolved continually over and over again in the New York Yankees versus the Boston Red Sox, right? And all these other teams that are sort of battling in a proxy war to decide who's on top this year, roughly speaking, right? And
So
there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly healthy because the alternative is war.
So can we really say that Protestantism was a bad thing? I mean, let's keep it real. You just said that all of that caused the greatest wealth in the world ever, and we're all like swimming in that right now. So that's hilarious. But I gotta hop off pretty soon. But I was thinking we should rename this video "Bubbles, Boundaries, Foundations, Frames, and Tolerance" or something like that. And
Okay.
and bitches.
There
Damn
you
it!
go.
I tried to say bitches and then leave, so I won't do that again. Sorry if
Yeah,
sorry if I've offended you.
Bye bye.
see ya.
Yeah,
There we go. That's what we do.
he can find his way out in the waiting room. I'm not
There we
tolerating that
go.
stuff.
Yeah, we should have helped them out there.
So, utilitarianism. Like
Unitarianism.
utilitarianism is a
No,
consequence.
Unitarianism, not utilitarianism.
Oh,
Unitarianism.
uh,
They have a tolerance problem. That is
well,
true.
I think
Unitarians are
Unitarianism
wimps.
has a discernment problem, and maybe tolerance.
Unitarians are wimps and can't enact anything in the world. Confirmed. We can just absolutely agree to that.
Okay, I thought utilitarianism was. Let's just take the utilitarianism because my brain was on
No,
that wave.
transfigured. Let's think about who it is. That'll help you. Utilitarianism is intolerant of any flaw. That's the problem with utilitarianism is that it's Puritanism. And they don't realize that because they're dumb because you're using logic, reason, and rationality, my three least favorite tools, to wrap up the world. It's like, yeah, that's not going to work. It's going to lead to this Puritanism.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, I want to rehash my point about bubbles, right? Like, so bubbles have an internal culture, I guess, right? Or not an internal culture, but an internal way of relating, like a way of seeing the world, right? Like a way of expecting things from others, right? And then when we step out of that bubble, like others are gonna be behaving differently, right? And there's this saying, when in Rome, act as the Romans do. And I think there's also this whole thing about Paul in when he's relating to the Greeks, right? It's like, how do we deal with these pagan worshippers, right? And they're accentuating this idea that when you have to relate to these people on the outside, then you have to adjust. You can't be as pure as you are in your home, right? Like it's the same thing. Like when you go to work, you can't have your family rules apply at work because you're having to account for other people around you. And when you're gonna take your family rules into work, you're gonna end up in conflict, right? Like now you're gonna end up being a bigot effectively, right? And so the bubble of family is a good thing. Like it's a good thing because that's a protective shelf where your kids can grow up. You can educate people in the safety and comfort that they need in order to be educated, because that safety and comfort might not be there if there's more tolerance towards different ways of being, right? So bubbles, good, imposition of bubbles bad? Like
Right.
that.
Right. Well, and I do want to address sort of the end of this, right? You're understanding that bubbles are not necessarily bad. That's good. And not from the particular bubble, like globally. Like you need people with different focuses, different specializations, focused on different things, right? Like if you're a scientist specializing in chemistry, the chemistry science bubble is important for all of us. It's, you know, so it's not, there's a global reality to the fact that things don't operate in the flat world on one layer, right? That there's multiple layers to the world. So the problem with immigration and assimilation is different places handle it differently. And you can just see like it doesn't take education and information, you know, from, you know, some particular source. You just look at the results. Like some immigration is always required. And the question is always how much. It's a perennial problem. And that amount changes over time, for sure, based on any number of factors. And that's the problem. Like everybody wants, you've been trained in science, or at least nominally told that science is good and you can just understand things by understanding the one largest moving variable in the equation. Some things don't have that property though. Right? Some things don't have, and reducing things to one variable means you're ignoring all of the other variables. And some of those may be small to the thing you're looking at, but big to other things that are way more important, right? And so it could be, if you let too many Muslims into the UK, that a problem arises. Or if you want an actual example, it could be if you let any relatively small number of Muslims into Sweden, you get fires and bombings, which they've had for years. Like it's a big problem, right? And so you think tolerance, but in Sweden, where it's a very monocultural society, unlike the United States, it's different, and they weren't allowing people or requiring people to assimilate, right? They weren't able to do that. And so that was a problem. They weren't allowing that. And because they weren't allowing that, there was no process of assimilation. The same problem in France, by the way, right? And so those people are acting out. And of course they're acting out. They're frustrated. You can't have what Sweden or France or some other country offers if you can't assimilate. And if the country doesn't allow you to, or doesn't force you to assimilate, then you're not going to have the same advantages. And so there's a trade-off. Just beliefs to have the advantages of living in another country, because you might have to. I'm not saying you do have to. I'm saying you might have to, right? There are trade-offs involved. And in the United States, the thing that makes immigration so successful is the desire of people to come into the country and actually want to be like us, right? They want to be like the Americans. They want the US ethos. Now, that's less true now, and so it's more of a problem than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, right? But it's a problem. And that's what we have to sort of decide on.
So yeah, about the immigration, like I'm going back to the body metaphor, right? Like, or well, I guess I want to go with bubbles in the body, right? Like a brain, right? Like has this, what is it? This barrier. Well, the cell has a barrier, right? Like in order for the cell to be a cell, it has to have its barrier. There's all of these barriers, and they're separating specific tissues from other tissues, because if the other tissue comes in, it corrupts, right? And then it's like, well, we want to let in the nutrients, and we want to get out the pollution, and then there's these other entities, right, like that need to travel through tissues in order to manifest something within the tissue, like blood to give oxygen, for example, right? So there's all of these things, and then there's a certain level of tolerance, right? So for example, you can get fat in your liver, right? Like, and that's okay up until a certain point, and then the fat in the liver starts disrupting the capacity of the liver to fulfill its
This is
function.
no hard work, though, Manuel. I want an easy answer like 4. 4 is a very easy answer. I like the answer 4. Can we
No,
have the answer 4?
no. I can only give you answers 5. Like I will give you the answer 5, but 4 is too simple.
What does Bazzini have to say here, if he has anything to say?
Well, I mean, the whole issue of assimilation and identity when it comes to immigration is like, well, immigration especially, but it's basically been the whole race conversation for the last 6 years, right? Um, and it's something that I think the whole whiteness thing is just done incredible damage to, just for the record. But there's this tension, right? You know, like I'm an Italian American, right? Um, what am I, right? you know, and and there's this kind of vague idea, or at least there used to be this vague idea of what it meant to be an American, right? And so like when my dad came over, right? Like he came over because he wanted to participate in this, right? And that sort
Right.
of thing, right? And so there was a lot of intentionality he had, both with how he raised us and both to keep some level of connection, back to the old country, right? But also to make sure that we saw ourselves as a part of what was going on here as well, right? And so there's it's that idea of you were saying it a different way, but the best way I've heard it described was, of course, Pageau and his fractals, self-replicating fractals, right? I'm an Italian slash Texan slash Christian slash, I mean, like, okay, I went to a certain university. I've got all these identities, right? And in some sense, I belong to all sorts of communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of
Oh,
all of
public.
that is part of who I am, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
That's
but
what you're doing.
yeah,
That's what you do. You manage the identities that you have and that will have conflicts in other spaces, because
right,
at some point, you've got your kids and they've got this event and they really want you there, but you've got work and they have a requirement. And at some point you have to be able to, decide between which identity is more important in that moment for that thing. And if you only have two identities conflicting at one time, consider yourself lucky.
yeah. But the where we've gone wrong with it in terms of multiculturalism is to say that there's no such thing as a national identity, right?
Right.
Because
Exactly.
we've decided nationalism is bad, right? We decided it's a
Right.
dirty word, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, basically what we've said is the idea of a national identity at all, right, is a bad thing. And
Right.
essentially what we've implicitly done with that is basically said we don't want to have a common identity. We don't want to have anything in common with each other,
A
right?
foundation, to go back to Chad's thing. We don't want to have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
common foundation on which to build things. And then we wonder why we can't get along and build things together. I don't know. This is a real brain teaser for me. It's as clear as day.
And
Yeah.
and and it's
So we
well,
when
yep,
we're talking about a shared identity, right? Like that identity forms a bubble, right? Like it's a thing that judges, right? Now people are going to be excluded, right? And now we can't be tolerant towards some people, right? So that's the problem that everybody is identifying. Is like, yes, people are going to be left out if we say we are a thing, because there's people who are not that. And those people have been having hard times throughout history because some of them were called witches and some of them were called whatever, and like they were kicked out, right? Like the gypsies, for example, right? Like were and the Jews, they've suffered a lot as a
Yeah.
consequence of having these national identities and them having their own identity, which they put higher than being part of the national identity, and therefore them necessarily being in conflict with what was manifesting within the country.
Right. And then here's an interesting question, right, for Bazzini in particular, but I'm going to answer it first because I can. Don't you want potential dissidents or quote bad people to conform to the standards of the bubble? Not necessarily. This is tolerance. How much tolerance do you have? What are the quote bad people? What is bad about them? And what is good about them? And is the good worth the bad? Because it's not like this single axis thinking is dangerous. Like people are not just good or bad, like generically most of the time. Sometimes they are, but not most of the time. And so, yeah, that is always the perennial problem. The question, the opponent, sorry, not opponent, the cooperative processing we have to do, right? We have to cooperate to say, are we going to let this crazy Italian person in here? Is he going to cause trouble? Because look, the Italians in the United States in the, I think it was the early 1900s, well, late 1800s to early 1900s, were almost all anarchists, and they were bombing the United States. So we had immigrants flooding into the country, literally setting off bombs left, right, and center. Not kidding. It's a period of history people know little about. If you want a quick overview of the culmination of that, you can look up the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, because that's the famous trial, sort of the extreme case too. So like, don't put too much stock in it. It only kind of happened once. But yeah, what do you want to say about that, Bazzini, about this, this conflict between letting people in and bad actors into a bubble?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to think about which bubble you're talking about, right? Now,
Right.
everybody who's in the country, right? Maybe in the country legally, I don't know, right? But whatever, right? Okay, then there's a legal code, right? You break the criminal laws, right? And there are consequences to that, right? You get removed from society, right? So I think it depends on the context, right? There's the bubble of my family, right? There's the bubble of my church, right? You know, my church is intolerant of Satanists, right? Is that such a bad thing? Like they can go ahead and they have their own church now, right?
Right.
Hey, you go do your thing, right? And maybe
No.
we can tolerate the fact that there's another bubble out there that says something different than my bubble that says. Right?
Maybe not.
Maybe, yeah.
I wanted to address Joey A. Apparently, I triggered Joey A. About Italians and me being anti-Italian, discriminating, and I succeeded in trolling Joey. I feel very proud about that, by the way, just in case anybody's wondering. So I'm most happy with myself. But the discernment's the problem, and that's really what we're talking about. What bubbles are we going to tolerate? What are we going to tolerate inside our bubble, right? And why? Like, we have to know why we're doing this. Why are we letting somebody onto our Discord server that just wants to, make things different from how they are? Why would you tolerate that person? It's a good question. Maybe you will. Like, maybe the Discord server's dead and you need a re-injection of energy, and this person, although they're destructive, bring a lot of positive energy into the situation. I don't know. Like, you can't, it's not, these things are difficult. They're supposed to be difficult. You're supposed to use your brain. Everybody wants to be rational. Here's your chance. Things are hard. You can be rational about all the hard things instead of trying to oversimplify, overreduce, make them political or mere economic or whatever.
Well, and I think it's also important to realize that when we're talking about these processes of removing people, these are high cost procedures, right? And I've always been thinking about all this re-education in jail and stuff, right? Like, that's all recent. Well, one of the reasons that it's recent is because it's costly, right? Like, it costs society a lot, and you need to have an affluent society in order to sustain these processes, right? So previously you just kind of had to kill someone or banish them or whatever. But like, if you banish a murderer, like, he's going to end up at a different place, right? Like is it okay to let them deal with the murderer, right? So there's a way in which the affluence allows different solutions to the same problem. And when you're talking about something like a Discord server, a church, or like a small company, like, there's just a limited capacity to handle problems, and sometimes it's better to just not take the risk of having to handle the problem than to have an infrastructure that has to deal with the problem. And so letting people in is not only decided by what you can do, but it's also like, do you want to take the risk? Like there's an engagement with the world, right? Like if you open your family house to the people living on the street, they're gonna bring things into your house. And like, are you willing to deal with all the mess that comes from that, or do you want to keep a clean house and say no, like it's not appropriate for these people to enter my house?
Or it doesn't have to be a person, right? It could be a device like Set, a little hat tip to Grim Grizz, right? Like, yeah, you can have a TV or you can have cable. I don't have cable, right? You can have these things, but what are they affording you? And then is that affording something you can deal with? Like, look, if I buy snacks at the grocery store and I take them to my house, I will eat all of them, probably to my detriment. So I don't bring them to the house. Although sometimes I slip up because apparently I'm a Muppet. So, right, sometimes I will buy candy bars and then I'll have candy bars all week after dinner or something stupid. These things happen, but you can also cut them off. Like these layers that we have to deal with, that are very difficult to deal with and not at all straightforward. If you think you're a rational creature, you should be happy about that. It gives your brain plenty of stuff to rationalize and decide about. But the layers are real, and separating the layers is important. If I don't bring the candy bars home, I won't have the problem of constantly eating stupid candy bars after every meal, right? And then I can reserve dessert for special occasions, which makes dessert all the more special from my perspective, right? So there's all of these trade-offs, and sometimes we have to restrain ourselves at the grocery store so we don't have to restrain our impulses when we're at home. Because getting up, going to the grocery store, buying a candy bar, because if I just went to buy, but it's too hard. And so, but if it's sitting in the cabinet, it's like, oh, you just go to the cabinet, open the cabinet, and turn it open, right? Like all these things play into it. We have passions, we have drivers, right? That's why we have to keep a clean, orderly house, because we have to be ready for company at any minute, unexpected. We have to be ready for a breakdown where, we're not because we do food and laundry, in the moment, when we're not feeling well, now we can't eat, right? And then the laundry piles up because we're not prepared, right? That's why we need to keep in front of our tasks in some sense, right? And all of these things are helpful to have that structure, and it's that structure in your life. It's that structure in your bubbles. It's that structure in your local government. It's that structure in your federal government. It's that structure in your church. It's that structure with your friends. That helps you so that when you're not at your best, because I don't know about you, but I'm not always at my best, you don't fall apart completely, because you can.
Well, one of the things that's going on right now, though, is that you essentially have this social pressure from outside of communities, basically coming into communities and essentially saying, you need to restructure your community, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to restructure your boundaries. You need to restructure the identity of what you are, right? According to the zeitgeist, right?
Right,
And
and you can tell the zeitgeist to pound sand, which is what I do. Yeah, that's nice.
well, yeah,
This happened last night. Well, actually, yeah, it happened last night. This guy who's problem on Discord, a couple of the members were being very nice to him, but he came in to attack me, and it didn't work because I didn't do anything wrong, and neither did Emmanuel. Right? He was upset because he didn't get kicked out, but he got muted on the server because he wouldn't behave the way we expected. And so what happened was these two people spent an hour explaining to him, you can do your thing your way. You don't have to engage with Mark Emmanuel. You can just have your own channel, do your own watch party, and nobody will bother you. And they probably won't go to it, especially if you request that they don't go. And he didn't like that answer. His ultimate answer, and it took an hour to get him here, was, no, I want Mark Emmanuel to change. And I told him, that isn't going to happen. You need a new plan for life, because your whole life is predicated on a change that will never happen ever. We're just not going to be the person or people that you want us to be. That isn't going to happen, right? And that's the issue. Like, it's not going to happen. And so you need to be able to be intolerant of people telling you to change sometimes. And the criticism is important. This wasn't criticism. This is just, I want you to be different. Not here's what you did wrong. There was nothing, quote, constructive in it, right? It was all just, I want you to be different the way you are in my head. I don't have access to your head. I don't know what that way is. I can't help you, right? And I'm not done, because I just don't care about you enough to make a change, right? So all of these things are factors. You as a community can say, you know what? We're not going to let these lunatics in. And when they're there, we're going to throw them out. This is the issue of too much tolerance. If you let people into, let's just say you have a church and they say, well, you need to be more tolerant of the 4 gay people in the world or whatever it is, and you believe them because it's an insignificant percentage of the population, guys. Really, it's 4 people. Like, stop catering or trying to cater to 4 people by changing everybody else, which is what they're trying to do, right? It's the tyranny of the small, effectively. You can just kick those people out of your church, and you should. Your church shouldn't say, well, we want to be tolerant of the people who are tolerant of something that we shouldn't tolerate. That's not a good formula. And groups have to stand up for themselves and say, no. The government says we have to do this. No. And maybe they'll pay a heavy price for that. Yeah, probably. Probably not. You know, who knows? I don't know. But those boundaries are important. Otherwise, you don't have a thing anymore. And postmoderns want to destroy all the things. They want no more structure, no more rules, no more anything. And because of that, there's no foundation that we can all build things on. And to Chad's excellent point, without a foundation, there's no framing. You need to have this foundation to have the framing be useful, because you will have to gather around the foundation to enter into the frame. Yeah, you do.
And I think it's also important to realize is like what is it they want, right? Because when you talk about these pride movements, for example, right? Like, it's tolerance isn't enough, right? Because tolerance is, well, is in some sense the suspension of judgment, right? And I would even say like in some sense it's maybe mercy that they're left to do what they want, right? And then because they're in a state of mercy, that is effectively having the implicit threat of having that being revoked or something, right? And so I think that's their conceptual experience, right? Like, there's this sort of Damocles that needs to be removed from our shoulders because we're carrying this burden, and the only way that can be removed is by positive affirmation, as opposed to a neutral relationship to them. And so I think it's really important to realize that the striving for normalization of something is, I don't know, like I don't think it's an actual thing, but the security, the emotional security of the individuals that are involved, right? And so then the problem with that is, well, what does it mean to have emotional security, right? And Vervaeke talks about this idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion, right, where it is the way that we're relating to the information around us that largely defines what we're perceiving, right? So if we're suspicious about us being repressed, then we're going to receive the signals as oppressive signals, right? And then we can start changing the signals and say, well, okay, this signal isn't okay anymore, but then we will start perceiving a new signal as oppressive. And the only way to get out of this vicious cycle is to realize that no, the suspicion is within me, right? And there is a set of signals that are oppressive and that do have to be related to, and these signals are only related to when they're manifest, because the problem with these things mostly is that they're relating to potentiality, right? Like, so there's an anxiety that is expressed towards something that could happen instead of something that's actually happened, right? Because in most countries, in the most civilized countries, we actually have laws now that protect people when these things actually happen, right? And so there's a way in which they will get support from the government when they're getting oppressed.
Right. Yeah, we keep pretending like oppression is some universal and really big problem. Sometimes it is, but not most of the time. And like most of the time, look, Brett Weinstein might say influence is our biggest problem, not oppression. And he might be right about that. Like that, I don't necessarily think that's incorrect way to think about it. I think I have better ways of thinking about it, maybe, but like maybe oppression isn't the big problem right now, but influence is. That's possible, right? Or maybe the big problem is incompetence and not oppression or influence. That seems more possible to me, right? Or maybe all three are equally contributing to a problem. Yeah, maybe. And who am I to judge that? Like, to some extent, I can't. To some extent, I can, and I can make claims about, well, maybe this is the problem. We just, and I do want to address sort of Joey's thing. Most communities are lacking ideas, guys. They have too many contributors and not enough critics. And this is especially true for internet groups. Yeah, I mean, the problem with the internet groups is that most of them aren't groups. They're spaces, and then people get together. And then those people get together around, we'll say, one or two issues or along one or two axes. And then they don't have enough intimacy with one another. And that's the problem. These people don't sort of understand that there's more to a community than a single issue, right? A healthy community has more than one axis of agreement, right? Which is not to say that things that are, we'll say, only about Dante aren't valid, quote, communities. It is to say that they aren't rich and able to be generative. So that's what you have to kind of be careful about.
Well, and it also part of a community is implicitly is going to be a sort of morality that's specific to that community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just like you were talking about the Vervaeke server, right? There's kind of a way of being that goes with being a part of that server, right? And so like when I'm on that server, it's a little bit different than a different server that I'm on, but you kind of, like, once you get a feel for that, right, then you also understand that to kind of go against that, right, is in some sense to violate the community, right? And
if you have a
yeah.
community, right? The Vervaeke server never had a community, right? Because the only thing we had in common were John Vervaeke's work, but there's 5 or maybe 7 different aspects to his work, and people were interested in different pieces. So even if you have 10,000 people, if they're all interested in different of the 5 pieces, and it's not much of a community anymore because it gets watered down by the splitting.
Right. Yeah, and but I guess just all I was really trying to get at is, so we were talking earlier about, like, kind of the government laws and restrictions and stuff like that, and yeah, and sure, but there's things that you can do in other contexts, right? Like we were talking about, right? That would effectively violate your relationship with that particular community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that should be called out, and maybe you should be kicked out of the community if you do that,
right?
And maybe that's not a bad thing, right?
No, it's not. This is
exactly.
This is the argument I made to Paul on Friday in the Q&A. Like, too much tolerance is a bad thing. You should think more about tolerance, when to apply it and when to withdraw it, right? Because it's not about you, although it's also about you. You're denying other people their sanity, their ability to know tolerance, to apply wisely the tolerance principles. You're denying the distributed cognition the sanity to work this stuff out. So the more tolerant you are, the more, the closer you get to war, right? The more problems you personally have and the distributed cognition the community has to understand when to take action, when to discern, and when not to. So you've got to exercise your tolerance by being intolerant. Otherwise, tolerance doesn't make any sense.
So we were watching this IT guy, this AI guy, and Peterson and Peterson and Peugeot were really tolerant towards that, right? And
way too tolerant.
And one of the issues that I have with people often is they don't realize, right, like when we're here on stream, you have a different relationship to me than when you talk to me privately. That doesn't mean that I like you less or more on the stream, but what it does mean is that the rule that I enact towards you is going to change, and like I'm going to slap you on the wrist on the stream for something I would tolerate without issue in a one-on-one relationship. And well, why do I do that? Well, the reason is because when you do something on the stream, there's a bunch of people watching. And as a consequence, what you're saying is not only affecting me, but it's affecting a set of people, right? And so when we're talking about being tolerant, where you can tolerate a lot more things in your personal space than in a group. And when you start applying, and this goes back to the bubble, right? Like when you start applying the rules of your bubble in a group, right? Like if you allow someone who is a noisy signal to get a lot of attention in a group, you corrupt the whole group, right? Like, because everybody's spending their time, energy, and attention with that person, and they're not spending it in union with the spirit of the group, right? And the group manifestation itself is frustrated, right? Because like there was a purpose for the gathering, and now that purpose is not manifesting. And so like this is one of the criticisms I have towards Paul, and like not even Paul, right? Like I have it to Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot. Like they let this idiot, like a literal idiot, although he apparently works with AI, which is also amazing that idiots can do that. But they let this idiot talk for an hour and a half as a supposed expert on stuff, and he was just spouting bullshit, like literally. And they were not contesting this bullshit, and it therefore gets put into the ether. First of all, as a valid signal, right? Because like you could put it in the ether and say it's an invalid signal, but they put it in as a valid signal. But even if it was put out as an invalid signal, you're still putting it out as an authority for some people to relate it with it. Like you're putting a light upon darkness, not in the way to illuminate it, but you're making it bigger. This is why you don't name demons. Like no.
Well, and it highlights another couple of problems, right? Like one of the problems is that you're legitimizing a voice that isn't legitimate. Like a lot of the things that Jim Keller said, I can tell you are technically wrong. He just made a bunch of statements that were false. Like you can look them up. They were false. The statements that he did make that everybody liked were we could. Oh, can we? How are you so sure about that? And some of those we could statements are false. We know they're wrong. I don't know what papers he's reading, but he's not reading the papers I'm reading that say, no, we can't do this. He's not doing the math that I'm doing, and I can't do math, so this is pretty sad, that say that's never going to work. Right? And we know this, and we know why. So I don't know why there wasn't enough pushback. But this also goes back to the larger point. Just having any 2 or 3 people or any group trying to talk things through on the internet is not necessarily a good idea, because the conversations that Manuel and I have, say, on the Discord server when we're sitting in a room by ourselves, change the minute somebody enters, right? Unless they don't, like there's a few people that it doesn't matter. They know what we're doing, right? But B, are all about exploration. And so because we're disagreeable, we'll make these statements, and we know what we're doing. We'll make these statements and proceed as if they're true, even when we're totally not sure at all, right? We're just exploring ideas, okay? You should not necessarily do that on YouTube. Like I don't, or in front of a large audience at all. I don't think that's valid. It can be, I'm not saying never ever, but most of the time, no. You have to be sure that your audience understands that you're exploring an idea that you don't have answers to, and that you're going to proceed with a level of certainty that you don't have. And I know Skylar has an excellent talk on agapic orientation, Manuel's excellent YouTube channel. It's a bit long, but it's worth listening to, right? He talks about this. Like he had an excellent philosophy teacher that would teach you dive into some particular philosophy and then present it as though he believed it, the teacher. And then he'd say, I don't believe any of that. And here's the next one. And he'd do it over and over again to teach you, you can get caught in a frame really easily and think that it's true because it has some explanatory power or descriptive power. And that's the problem. It's like, well, but what if it doesn't? What if you've just been fooled? Or what if it has no prescriptive or predictive value? And that's one of the problems, is that can run into issues. You don't want to boost those signals to people who aren't ready to hear them and don't understand them. And you don't want to boost bad signals like Jim Keller. Jim Keller just made up a bunch of stuff. He said a bunch of stuff that we know is not true. He actually did. I was furious. I was actually furious. I was like practically screaming. I was so angry that anybody would take my beautiful profession and just lie about it left, right, and center. I'm sure he didn't know that was what he was doing, but it doesn't matter. You can't let people like that go uncontested, because it does give a bad signal.
Yeah, and he contradicted himself within sentences like multiple times. Like, I believe in people, but you can't trust them. It's like, well, you gotta pick one, dude. Like you can't say these things and like proceed as if you said something intelligible. Like, because now it's like, why are we talking about something that like what did you say? Like, did you say something that I could do something with? Like, and he's making this not as, well, I have these personal problems and therefore, no, he's making them as statements about people, right? And about his being in the world, which is, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a problem. I wanted to address this. My views on AI are, a lot of the AI is hype, almost all of it. The idea of artificial general intelligence is literally a waste of time to think about. We are so far away from anything remotely resembling artificial general intelligence. It's not even funny. A, we don't have a definition of intelligence. B, we don't have a definition of what general intelligence would be. And so C, we can't measure it. So how would we know that we achieved it? We wouldn't. Okay. One of the statements that Jim Keller made is that, the AIs we use today map the brain. No, they don't. We know that they don't. Right. So you can look at the work of John Vervaeke, for example, in 4E Cognitive Science. They have 4 types of memory. How many types of memory does AI have? Actually, close to 0. You can make an argument for non-zero with long-term memory, LTSMs. You can make some arguments about that, and RNNs kind of have a short-term memory, whatever, right? But they don't have 4 types of memory, okay? We're not mapping the brain. Right? Neurons have multiple in-out connections, okay? Neurons and neural nets do not have multiple in-out connections. You can simulate that through deep learning, which is what Jeffrey Hinton did in the 90s, big breakthrough, University of Toronto, very good stuff, love his work. Also, he used different algorithms, right? So, like, you'd have to be a real technician to know all this stuff, and I happen to be somebody who's been into it since the 90s, so I actually do know most of the history and all of that stuff. A lot of the stuff they're telling you is bullshit. You can put a sticker on a stop sign. There's a white paper about this. Put a sticker on a stop sign, and then the AI can't see it anymore. That's not good pattern recognition to me, because the car will run a stop sign and kill people. So I'm not a fan, right? Also, still can't take a left turn. 10 years of development and the car can't take a left turn. So I don't know. I mean, AI can do some neat things within some very tight boundaries, and it's really good at that. And when those boundaries are removed, you can't do anything at all. Sorry. So, and I'm a big fan of AI, and I use AI. I've made many, many, many AI models. I've used pre-AI, symbolic regression, all this other stuff, support vector machines, you name it. I've looked into all of it. I've played with code for all of it. I've coded a lot of it from scratch, like line by line in C from scratch. I know a lot about this. It's all hype, right? Which is not to take away from what it can do. It's obvious. Like, AIs are really good at recognizing faces now. In fact, they're really good at recognizing people from behind, better than humans. But there's some downsides to that. And Jim Keller didn't talk about any of the downsides, which is a good hint that he's not being honest with himself, maybe, right? I'm not saying he's a dishonest person. He's not being honest about the technology. Because if you can't speak to the downsides while you're speaking to the upsides, maybe you shouldn't be talking about it, right? And then maybe you should. Like maybe it's a, if you're going to an AI conference, don't say anything bad about AI. Fair enough. But if you're talking to the general public, you shouldn't present it as an untrammeled good or something, because AI is certainly not that, and it's not as successful as it seems because you don't realize all the AI failures. Because there's a lot of failures. There's things they've been trying to do for 50 years that they haven't been able to do. And they just don't talk about that. And like, fair enough. But, you should point out that it's not all win, 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 win in AI by any means.
Well, and I think there's something like an is-ought gap, right, that we need to think about when it comes to AI as well, right?
Well,
Like
yeah.
I don't, yeah. I mean, the way I usually, whenever you guys start talking about this, I always think of, kind of like, like AIs might have intelligence, but they don't have wisdom, right? But because this is how we are, right? And this is what people do, right? What we're going to do is we're going to say, oh, this AI is so smart now. So let me ask it a question like, what should I do about climate change, right? Or
Right.
or what should we do about euthanizing, the disabled, right? Whatever, right? We're going to start asking it questions that we have, that first off, like even scientists shouldn't be asked, right?
Right.
But we're going to start asking that to the AI, and the scientists probably are going to be hunky dory asking that question to the AI, because that's science, right?
Right.
And
Well, it's an attempt to resolve the intelligence problem. So if you
Right.
think that epistemology is what runs the world, and roughly speaking, that's what we're living with. We're living with a bunch of people who think knowledge is the most important thing and can solve all the problems, right? Without realizing that knowledge creates more problems than it solves on average, right? Because that science actually indicates that, believe it or not, right? But if you believe that knowledge is the issue, right, then something that has more knowledge than you do, or could have more knowledge than you do, will win the day. But the bottom line is there's a big difference between information, and actually Vervaeke's starting to see this, which is good, knowledge, which is processed information, and intelligence, which is what you're doing with the knowledge that you have and how you're applying it, roughly speaking, right? And when you don't have a sophisticated model like that, that's very complicated and perhaps even complex, then you're missing the real problem. And I like Mohammed's comment here, right? Other than actual pragmatic application, my theory is that the whole AI thing is a limerent fantasy to escape our own lives rather than take responsibility and fix our own damn problems. Right? We want to outsource the problem solving for the things that some people might call them egregores, right? For the spirits that are moving us. And we want a solution, and we want one solution. And we make this deep confusion, and I wanted to mention this earlier, right? Between things that work at scale me, one person, and things that work at scale many people, right? And there's more than one of those problems all the way up the stack, right? Ways you can solve problems for yourself are not the same as the way people can solve problems in a group, which are not the same as a family, which are not the same as a state, which are not the same as a federal government, which are not the same as the world. And so when we go, aha, I have an answer. I know how to solve climate change. I will drive an electric car. Okay, that only works for you. It doesn't work for everybody else. It can potentially maybe work for everybody else until you scale up and realize we don't generate enough electricity in the United States to do anything like that, right? And even if we did, we can't transport that electricity. So we're not all getting an electric car. That cannot physically actually happen in the material realm, right? And so that solution doesn't scale. It's also not the best solution to the problem, but that you can see the way in which a solution that could work for you individually and get you out of your personal guilt about harming Gaia or whatever, hurting the earth, right? Doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't work for everybody all at once, and it's not necessarily a thing that everybody can do. And so all of these things are big problems. Like your ability to solve a problem a certain way doesn't mean anybody else can engage.
I think we want to take the word technology serious, right? Like Techne logos, right? Which is like it's like an interface to relate to to the world, right? And so when we get a better interface, right? Like we extend our capacity, but thinking of it as somehow separating from you is then you're making a mistake, right? And and like that shouldn't even be the purpose of a tool, right? Like
Mhm.
the tool is supposed to do something, and the problem with these tools is that we don't know what they're doing, but we're still using them, right? So there's this hidden aspect to it, and then yeah, like if you're using things to move the world where you don't know what they're actually doing, you don't know what the expression of your agency is, and you can't take full responsibility. And that, yeah, like that's a bad development, and that needs to stop because we're we're already really bad in taking responsibility, right? So I'm going to go back to where we were, right? Like we need to find a way to the transgressions that we made in the past, and they accumulate side effects, right? So when our transgression is manifesting through AI, in other words, manifesting through unintelligibility, how do we apply corrections to the error?
Right. Right. And how do we even understand what the error is? Like what's our measuring stick?
Yeah, so that is really problematic, and I think we all like I really like this framing, right? Like there's this buildup of clutter in whatever way of intelligibility there is, right? And technology is only going to increase the way that the clutter manifests because it is distancing us, right? Like the techne is a skin between us and the world, right? Which means that we don't get hurt as much by our failures, which means that our feedback systems are less direct, and the need to correct our problems is uh, is also removed from us. And you could even go further, right? Like with the microplastics, for example, right? Like in some sense, it's not our problem, right? Like it now it's the world's problem, and my personal responsibility can't be linked back. And then it's like, well, but I'm not completely responsible for the microplastics because the microplastics are manifested throughout the whole line of
Before,
production.
before
And
I was born, even, right? We
well,
started
that's
before I
also
was
true.
born, right? And will continue after I'm gone. So how can I have responsibility? What's my level of responsibility?
Right, because like you can say, well, I'm gonna buy this product who doesn't have microplastics, right? Now you have to have a way to judge how that is true, and then you have to be able to judge it for all your products, right? Like it's impossible to take that responsibility as an individual.
Yeah. Right. And we want AI to solve that for us instead. Right. And that's the problem. We want it to fix a problem that's bigger than us without acknowledging that there are problems that are bigger than us and the implications of that realization. Like, wait a minute, I'm just a small muppet in the world. It's like, yeah, you're a small muppet in the world. And you were born into things like plastics that you had no choice over, right? Or past transgressions, whether it be slavery, or your religion attacking another religion, or an ancestor that was a killer. Like, who knows? Like, I don't know. There's all kinds of things that happened in your past that you have to be able to deal with, integrate with, in your current time. And that's to some extent what we're uh, you know what we're struggling with. So what do you think about the idea that the motivation for creation of AI is the motivation for creation of children? Well, yeah, problems themselves are in the context of the forever survival game. I don't know if I agree with the problems being in a context of forever survival game. Look, lots of frames work. kind of, right? And we get caught up in that. It's like, oh, you can think of a problem this way, or you can think of a problem that way, or you could, right? And that's useful. Like, I'm not saying don't, but that doesn't mean that they're fully valid frames or they're the best way to think about a problem. So yeah, I mean, look, a thing like AI, and I have to come up with my formulation again. I had it years ago. We don't do things for a single motivation. Like that never happens. Okay. Things that we do have to satisfy multiple layers of analysis. And to use Peterson framing, right? Multiple layers of analysis must be satisfied. And so we're not merely doing AI to solve a problem that's too big for us. We're also doing AI to become the creators and birthers of something that otherwise would not be born, right? Which makes us special and unique parents of something. That's definitely part of the motivation. So in other words, part of our motivation is egoic in the local frame. Like, I want to do something that I can be known for contributing, even if I'm the only person that knows it. At least I know I did this, right? And some people, me knowing it's not enough, right? They're grandiose or something, right? Or they're the marketing types, right? But also, I want to do something that outlasts me. Yes, everybody has that. Right? And also, I can use, well, this thing will be smart enough eventually, or my contribution to this effort of AI will lead to something that will eventually be smart enough to solve the climate crisis or whatever, right? Like, yes, right? All of these motivations stack up and align. But again, it's not a simple equation like, well, you want this, or you did this because of this, right? And a lot of times you can't look at outcome, right? Consequentialism is dumb. Like, it's just observably stupid. You can't look at outcome and say, therefore, that's what they wanted to do. In all cases, sometimes you can, but it requires a lot of understanding of all the framing going on, right? To get the idea of that. So it's easy enough to say that a dictator wanted to destroy a country. Like you could say that Napoleon, for example, hated France, and that's why he led them, especially in his last war, right? Because he hated France and he was pissed off that they didn't manifest what he expected. But you could also recognize that he was Corsican and he never liked France because they took his family fortune away when he was young, and it was very traumatic to him. And so you could say Napoleon was always acting out the destruction of France, even in his winning, right? He killed off a lot of French people and subjugated them to Corsican rule effectively, right? So it's not really clear exactly what his motivations were because he didn't have a single motivation. And it's not clear where that would have ended,
And
right? Or how that would have ended.
I think it's more important when I go outside and drive in a certain direction, right? You can say, well, I went that direction because I wanted to go that direction, but that's not true, right? Like, I wanted to go to my friend, and I went
Right.
that way because I wanted to go to my friend, and in order to get to my friend, I needed to pick that direction, right? So
Right.
you can
Well,
say there there's an explanatory power within me going that direction, but it does not suffice.
right.
It has not sufficient explanation for my behavior. So, and we start confusing that, right? Like, because
Right.
when I want to go that way, like, it's like, okay, like, that information might be useful if you're in my way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
apart from that, like, it's not useful, right? Even if you want to block me, I'll just take the next street, right? So it's like, no, like,
Correct.
that's not helpful. So when you're having these framings, or like, oh, if I make an observation, I can make an explanation about what's happening, is like, no, the explanation about what's happening is often not contained in the observation, because it's not accounting for my internal state when I do the action, right? And the internal state is always connected to a way that I want to manifest in the world, right? Like, so I see a purpose, like, I try to pursue that purpose, and in order to pursue that purpose, I manifest a behavior in the world. And some people pursue purposes that are the behavior in the world, and they have really limited ways of manifesting themselves in the world. Like, oh, I drink because I want to get drunk, or whatever. It's like, yeah, well, that that is not something that will get you very far in life.
No, and it's important to know that the level of rationality and competence you're assigning to other people is likely unwarranted. So you can say that, well, I know why Manuel picked that direction to get to his friend's house because there's a lot of traffic in another way that's shorter, right? Except maybe that's not the reason he had it all, because he knows there's a house with nice flowers and it smells nice when you go past it, and that's why he went that way. You have no way to know that. You might be able to guess, but you don't know that. So from the outside, it looks like he made a bad decision, right? But maybe if his goal wasn't to get to his friend's house as quickly as possible, but to use going to his friend's as an excuse to go past these pretty flowers, these things happen. And then also, let's suppose that the route that you think he should have taken to go to his friend's house is actually shorter, we'll call it in intersubjective reality, right? But he doesn't know that. He has a belief that it's not shorter. And maybe because one time he went, it wasn't shorter, right? Or it didn't seem like it was quicker or something.
Well, and I can tell you,
left.
In actuality, I don't take the shortest route because I have this racing bike now. And in order to go to some place, when I can go long period straight, it's faster and less effort, although I probably use more calories.
Right, but again, that's the I know what I'm doing and I'm doing it for a reason you don't understand argument. But the argument I'm making is sometimes people are doing things for reasons they don't understand or they're wrong about, like they just have bad information. So it could be that maybe none of that's a factor, but it's something else, like your ignorance about the fact that this other route is more efficient, because that happens all the time. We project out and say this person is a rational actor. Are they really? And they're competent. Are they real? Are you sure? And then we project out they know what we know. Do they? And are you sure you're the one that knows more than they do? Because I'm not sure of any of those things.
Well, and I can tell you from my experience, right? Like I just did this thing and then I thought about it and I said, okay, like I approve. Like I don't know what the other options are. So like it's not even a rational decision.
Well, there's an interesting concept that I don't know how much it was used outside of our economics department, but one of my professors had a term, he called it fantastical thinking, right? And so that's what's used to describe someone putting together an entire chain of really unlikely events, right? Going the way that they want them to go, right? Because they want to see this particular outcome, and that's what shapes and motivates their actions, right? And I was just thinking about that in terms of the discussion that we were watching yesterday, right? Because what you heard, basically the guy describing was, what I would call fantastical thinking, right? AI is going to stay in its lane. We're not going to use AI for the wrong things, and so on and so forth, right? And this is all going to work out to where in the end I'm going to have been a part of building this amazing new thing that's going to make the world so much better and blah blah blah, right? But is that really what's going to happen? Is that even remotely possible that's going to happen? Is kind of a whole different question that he didn't even want to talk about, right? Because he so focused on the desired outcome, I think, right? And kind of his view was clouded by that.
Yeah, exactly. And I call it magical thinking. So I posted a link to my magical thinking video on navigating patterns, which is interesting that people fall into this magical thinking and you can hear it. I mean, Jim Keller was actually very careful at the end of the day with his language. He kept saying, we could. Some of the things he said we could too, we cannot. We know this. I don't know why he said that. But some of the things maybe we could, right? Maybe. But will we? Because that's a whole different question. Like if we stop all AI research tomorrow, maybe we won't. And maybe that's unrealistic. But maybe one person realizes the danger or senses the danger, whether it's real or not, and then kiboshes a whole bunch of AI research that would otherwise be useful to AI. These things happen in history all the time. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't be discounting such things. People have been saboteurs for years, particularly against technology, and maybe for the better. I don't know, but we have to account for that. Like, we can't just say we could. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. These are hard things. But if you think you're rational, use your rationality and actually think about it. Take a long time. Do some research, right? Well, most people just don't research anything that they're talking about ever, whereas I tend to do a lot of research on things, right, before I start yapping about them when I can, and when I don't, I try to say, I haven't really researched this yet.
So, do we want to get to some sort of conclusion?
Yeah, I think it's time to wrap it up. It's past your bedtime over there, Manuel, over there in the Netherlands. So
No, not yet. General people's bedtime, yes. So we started this off with the distinction between mercy and tolerance. We have talked a lot about tolerance. So maybe we can give mercy a little bit of mercy. So yeah, mercy is the allowing things to exist even when they're not supposed to be there, effectively. So yeah, I'm trying to get to the good part in that. Well, okay, well, Peterson talks about this, right? Like, because what is the thing that you have mercy to? It's the remainder, right? Like that which is not part of the whole. And there's a potential for a redemptive quality from there, because it's a perspective that is new, so it can get a purity, right? Like, if there's a directness to nature in some sense that is on the outside that isn't there within the inside, right? Because the body is shielded from the outside, and that brings with it a perspective that can spot the corruption of the body. And so mercy is in some sense leaving space for the opportunity of having correction.
Or it's how you deal with the fact that you left space for the opportunity of correction. And tolerance is the way that you leave space, right? But intolerance is also the way that you make sure that space is enacted, right? Because again, if you're too tolerant, there's nothing to be merciful for. You've already accepted it, so you can't grant mercy, right? So tolerance destroys mercy.
Yeah. So I think mercy is connected to a virtue, right? Because like mercy is, well, what I think. Mercy probably has to do with the recognition of the good within the bad, I guess, right? Because you judged it.
Right.
And so there is a virtue in that, and I think we can decide that tolerance isn't a virtue. And so then the being too tolerant denies us the development of the capacity of judging the good in the bad as well, which
right.
is also a problem.
Right. Anytime you can't judge the bad, you also can't judge the good, and therefore too much tolerance is a net loss, because you lose your ability to discern the good from the bad. Yeah. So that's the problem of too much tolerance, is it actually blocks mercy. And I think the problem, I know Ethan was talking about this, like the problem is people are confusing, and so is Sally Joe, right? People are confusing tolerance and mercy, and they're sort of compressing them into one thing. Oh, let's give tolerance, and then we'll have given mercy. It's like, no, that's not how that works. You need that whole chain of discernment all the way up, in order to have good decision-making processes and be able to separate the good from the bad, or the good from the evil, or maybe both, because those are different things.
Right, and then right, like the remainder can have proper gratitude for being allowed in the whole, which also allows for redemption and stuff. Like it's like there's a bunch of things like
Tolerance, yes, tolerance cuts off redemption. That's right. If you're too tolerant, there's no need for redemption. Redemption never happens. And so you're denying them part of the important part of the Christian story. At that point, if you're a Christian, so being too tolerant is not good. It's not good on lots of levels.
so. Bazani, you want to have the end word on this? We criticized Protestantism like that. That was implicit. But... Well, good choice. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll do this again soon. I think that went really well. Random topic that was on the mind. Oh, there we go.
Come on, Bazani.
Oh, geez.
Oh,
I like
hey. Okay. I think mercy should always be purposeful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You extend, mercy implies a transgression has happened to begin with, right? And the forgiveness of that, the mercy for that, like it should, there should be a purpose around that, right? Otherwise, it's just giving license, right? Which isn't, like, that's something else, and that I don't think is virtuous. But anyway, just a thought.
Yeah.
Wow. Good stuff. Sign up for Navigating Patterns, my personal YouTube channel, and Agapic Orientation.
My personal YouTube channel, and redeem everything in the world. Thanks for watching.
See you guys.